Kayla were fully on my side. If I were going to take down a bandit boss, as well as some evil magical master, I was going to need a little support. My gaze roved over Kayla's sweet, sleeping expression, and my heart gave a familiar lurch. I let my eyes shift over to Aurora, and my eyes swept over her soft mouth and pale cheeks as she twitched in her sleep. Unable to stop myself, I leaned forward to brush my lips over her nose, and the half-elf sighed pleasurably. I pulled back an inch and watched as the Ignis mage slowly blinked open her emerald green eyes. "Good morning," I whispered with a smile.
"Morning."
Aurora mumbled back as her jaw cracked with a yawn. Then she smacked her lips and nuzzled against my shoulder.
"Have you been watching me sleep again?"
"Only a little," I admitted, and I ran my fingers gently down the length of her bare arm. "Can you blame me, though?" Aurora's lips twitched with the beginnings of a smirk, but when she fluttered open her eyes again, her mouth quickly dipped into a frown.
"What is wrong, Mason?"
she asked softly as she reached up and stroked the beard on my chin.
"Your eyes look troubled."
I blinked in surprise, but then a small smile pulled at my lips. "Can't get anything past you, can I?"
"No."
Aurora answered simply.
"Now, what is it?"
"I need to talk to you about something," I sighed. "But we have to wait for Kayla to wake up, because I want to tell you both at the same time."
"I'm awake,"
a quiet voice replied, and I turned my head slightly to see the princess blink her ice-blue eyes open. Oh. My heart skipped a beat as I realized this was the moment of truth. "Well, right then. Actually, do you want to get some breakfast first? I think this conversation might be easier on a stomach full of sod poodle." I made to sit up and slide out of the bed, but Aurora caught my arm.
"You cannot say something like that and then run,"
the half-elf said as she frowned at me. She sat up slightly against the pillows, and as the blanket slid down her chest, my eyes latched on to the exposed and pale skin. What was I talking about?" I mumbled. Faint morning light spilled between the cracks around the curtain, and it illuminated the silhouette of Aurora's. "I think it'll be easier if I just show you," I said, and then I patted Aurora's hand to release me. When the half-elf let go, I scooted to the end of the bed and stood up. The morning air was cool against my bare skin, but I shivered and shook it off. Then I walked over to my bag and picked up the little silver stick man. The metal was cold on my palm, but that quickly changed as I summoned up my magic and recarved the rune Nemris had shown to me 2 days ago. At first, nothing happened, but then a faint whitish glow enveloped the stick figure. When it faded, I felt the little stickman twitch. I turned back to the 2 women in bed and held out my hand. Just as they leaned forward curiously, the stickman's whole body jerked, and he lifted his head. Aurora reeled back, her emerald eyes wide as dinner plates.
"What in the name of the gods?"
Kayla's mouth had fallen open, and she scrambled to pull the sheet tighter against her bare chest.
How did you—
"It's okay." I held up my free hand in a soothing gesture. "He doesn't bite. At least I think he doesn't." I peered down at the little stick man as he toddled to his feet. His head was a smooth, featureless ball, sans mouth, teeth, or any other facial characteristics. But somehow he exuded a sense of personality. He waddled to the edge of my palm like he had the first time and craned his neck to look at the ground. Then he glanced up at me for a second, as if to gauge my reaction, before he took a step forward and tumbled out of my hand. Kayla gasped loudly, and my magic reacted instinctively. Before the stickman could smash into the ground, my power jerked him to a stop an inch off the floor. I gingerly set him down on his feet, and he immediately began to walk forward toward the bed. Well, it was more of a waddle, since his legs didn't really bend. In fact, he kind of looked like a 2-dimensional sketch brought to life, something a child would draw before they learned the concept of joints, like knees and elbows.
"What's it doing?"
Aurora asked as we watched the stick figure approach the bed. The 2 women had drawn their legs up under them like they were worried the little thing would bite their toes off. I'm not really sure," I admitted as I rubbed the back of my neck. This is only the second time I've used this power.
When was the first?
The half-elf followed up as she glanced at me and then back to the stick man. The night of the feast, I confessed with a sigh, after we went to sleep. The stick figure had reached the foot of the bed, and he stopped next to one of the wooden legs as if he was contemplating his next move. Then he continued to walk forward, and he rebounded off the bed's leg with a small ping. He stumbled backward and pinwheeled his arms to stay upright, and when he regained his balance, he tried again. The result stayed the same.
Why didn't you tell us sooner?
Kayla asked, and I lifted my eyes from the stick figure to meet the princess's gaze. Her pink lips were turned down in a slight frown, and her porcelain brow furrowed delicately. Well, one reason was that I didn't want anything to distract us before we set off on our journey, I said as I rubbed at the goosebumps that had risen on my arms. I cast my eyes around the small room and saw my clothes crumpled in the corner. I walked over to them and pulled on my pants first and then my shirt. Having this conversation while naked made me feel a little more vulnerable than I liked.
You make it sound as if that is not the main reason,
Aurora observed as she pursed her lips. That's because it's not, I replied with a sigh. I walked back over to the bed and then stooped down to pick up the little stick man that was still smacking head first into the leg of the bed. When I sat down on the edge of the mattress, I set him on the blankets.
Then what is the main reason?
Kayla asked with a tilt of her head.
I think the more important question is how you were able to do this at all.
Aurora cut in as she watched the stick figure struggle across the mountain range of the bedding.
Your metal mage abilities were a shock, but they still operate under the same premise of other elemental magic. This, I've never seen or heard of anyone bringing inanimate objects to life.
Funnily enough, the answer to both of those questions is one and the same, I said with a wince. Before I give that answer, though, I want to say one thing. My heart had begun to pound like a jackhammer beneath my ribs, and sweat beaded along my hairline and the nape of my neck. I took a deep breath and exhaled shakily.
Mason, you're scaring us,
Kayla said with a deep frown, and her ice-blue eyes were wide with trepidation. That's exactly what I don't want, I chuckled without humor. Then I reached out and took both Aurora and Kayla's hands. I never want to scare you or hurt you, and that's why I've kept this secret.
What secret?
Aurora asked as her spine went ramrod straight. I could tell by the hurt in her emerald gaze that Abris's betrayal had wounded her deeply, and the pain was still fresh. I sighed and squeezed both of their hands. My own had started to shake a little. I don't know where the best place to start is, so I'm just going to try my best, I told the two women. I misled you when we first met, Aurora. The half-elf inhaled sharply and tried to withdraw her hand from my grasp, but I held on tightly.
How so?
She asked, and there was an edge of steel in her tone. Not in the way you're afraid of, I assured her. I bear no ill will toward Ilaria, or Cetus for that matter. I really have come here to learn my new powers and to help in any way I can.
So what was the lie?
Kayla questioned. Her voice was a little softer than Aurora's, but her lips were still pursed into a thin line. It wasn't an outright lie, I hedged. It was more that I omitted some details. Some very important, but confusing details.
Mason!
Aurora said sharply, and I knew I was trying the Ignis Mage's patience. I had to just come out and say it. I'm not from a faraway kingdom, I blurted, but then I backtracked a little. Well, I am, but not in the way I led you to believe. I'm actually from another world. A place that is completely separate and more than a little different from this one. Silence met my declaration. The only noise in the room was my racing pulse, my shallow breathing, and the scratch of metal on fabric as the stick man continued his long and perilous journey across the bed.
I do not understand.
Kayla finally said at length, and her face was twisted into an expression of complete confusion. Aurora, on the other hand, stared at me with her eyes narrowed, but the rest of her face was totally placid. I know it's difficult to comprehend. I cringed as I rubbed at the back of my head. This is the only way I know how to put it, though. I was born on a planet called Earth in the year 1988. The country I come from is called America, but there were hundreds of other countries that were home to billions of people. My world is very different, though points in its history actually closely resemble this world. But currently Earth is very technologically advanced, which is how I created the guns and the bike. They weren't visions from the gods, they were actually memories. Memories from my past life. As I lapsed into silence again, I looked closely at both of the women before me. As I expected, they seemed absolutely thrown by this truth bomb I had dropped on them. Kayla's mouth opened and closed again and again as she tried to find her words. Thankfully, the harshness had faded from Aurora's face, but now the half-elf's emerald eyes eddied with bewilderment. Her gaze roamed across my face as if she was looking for a tell, something to reveal that I was lying or pulling an elaborate prank. But when she saw the frank sincerity in my eyes, she shook her head and fiddled with one of her braids.
That is an unbelievable story, Mason,
she muttered. It's the truth, I said gently.
Then how did you come to be here?
She fired back as she lifted her chin.
If what you are saying is true and you hail from another realm, then how did you arrive in Alaria?
I winced. Actually, that really was the work of the gods. Well, one goddess in particular. Her name is Nemris. As I said her name, a shiver raced up my spine, and the hair on my arms stood on end. I remembered the feel of her lips as she kissed me a few nights ago, and then the memories she had shown me from my previous lives passed before my mind's eye.
A goddess!
Aurora echoed sarcastically with a cocked eyebrow.
You met a goddess and she brought you here.
Yes, I replied with a firm nod. I know this all sounds crazy, but it's the honest truth. I've apparently known Nemris for many lifetimes, though I can't recall those memories with any great detail. I only get flashes. Either way, it turned out that I had curried Nemris's favor in another life, and so she let me travel here. She's the one who granted me the metal mage abilities, and she's also responsible for giving me this new power. As if on cue, the stickman snagged our attention again. He had finally traveled the length of the bed, and he now bumped against Kayla's knee beneath the blanket. We all looked down at him, and then the princess reached out tentatively with her hand. She laid her hand flat beside the stick figure, and he flopped forward into her palm before he used her thumb to pull himself upright again. When he was standing, he looked up at Kayla almost expectantly, and the wide-eyed, raven-haired beauty lifted her hand up to her face. The stickman reached out his little metal arm and patted Kayla on the cheek, almost like he was comforting her. The princess giggled and extended a finger on her other hand to pat the stick figure on the head in return.
I must admit, he is rather adorable,
Kayla said as the stickman pushed his head into the pad of her finger like a cat would. I smiled at the interaction, but then I looked up to find Aurora frowning at me. I guessed she wasn't as moved by the stick figure's cute antics.
Can you prove this?
The half-elf asked me point blank.
Can you prove this tale about your other world and your goddess?
What do you want me to do? I questioned as I spread my arms wide. I can regale you with memories all day. I can make as many gadgets from my world as I possibly can with materials that we have available. I can even draw pictures if you want, though I'm not by any means an artist. I'll do whatever I can to reassure you, Aurora. I never want to lie to you.
You have before?
The Ignis mage pointed out. When you were a stranger, I said with a frown. The day we met, I had only woken up in this world mere minutes before. I was still trying to get my bearings, and then you came running out of the trees with a drake hot on your trail. I was just reacting at that point. And then things snowballed from there with my metal mage powers, the gun making, and the attacks, and by the time I realized I'd fallen in love with the two of you, I didn't know how to bring this up.
Then why tell us now?
Kayla asked as she looked up from prodding at the stickman in her hand. Because I was tired of having this big thing between us, I replied honestly. And also this new power is important. I don't know what all I can do yet, but this feels like a game changer. It could change the way we save Cetus. Kayla's blue eyes lit up like Christmas lights, and a smile stretched across her luscious mouth.
Okay,
She said brightly, and then she looked back to the stickman that was toddling over her palm. Okay, I echoed as my jaw dropped open a little. That's it? Kayla nodded and then giggled again as the stick figure fell over.
how are you accepting this so easily?
Aurora asked as she crossed her arms over her bare breasts. The princess shrugged and continued to waggle her finger at the little stickman.
Mason has always seemed strange to me.
Hey! I protested with a pout.
Not in a bad way.
Kayla added with a grin as she met my eye.
It is just... Well, if I am to be honest, you are strange to me too, Aurora.
Aurora's brow furrowed and she reached up to touch at her pointed ears, always sensitive about her elven heritage.
Not like that either.
The princess said gently.
I simply mean that I'm normal, and you both are mages. Your powers are godlike. You can conjure up a flame from nothing, Aurora, and if needed, you could tame and control a wildfire. That is nothing short of incredible. Thank you.
The tops of the Ignis mage's cheeks reddened at the compliment, and then Kayla turned to me.
And you, Mason, can move and manipulate the very ground we walk on,
She said.
Coupled with your metal mage abilities, it always seemed like there was nothing you could not do.
I preened a little at that and puffed out my chest. Well, I don't like to brag.
You most certainly do.
Kayla teased with a grin.
At least a little. However, this is all to say that every day with the two of you is a new surprise. I have simply learned to take it all in stride.
So, you believe me, I said, and you're not upset. Even though I was the one to drop the truth bomb, I was still trying to wrap my head around this new situation I found myself in. Kayla tilted her head to the side and lowered her hand, and the stickman to her lap.
Do you still love us?
What? I asked. Of course I do.
And do you still intend to help us find this mysterious master Abris mentioned, and stop my kingdom from falling into further ruin?
She added. Yes, I intoned seriously. Nothing will stop me from seeing those things through.
Then no, I am not upset.
Kayla replied with a warm smile.
And tomorrow you could turn into a horse before my very eyes and I would still love you. You are a good man, Mason Flint. No matter where you came from or what power runs through your veins, I know this to be true.
As my heart did somersaults beneath my sternum, the raven-haired beauty leaned forward and pressed her lips softly against mine. I sighed into her mouth and lifted a hand to caress her smooth cheek. Thank you, I whispered as I pulled away, and Kayla's smile widened.
Thank you for being honest.
The princess returned, but then her eyes flickered to the silent half-elf beside us. I turned to face Aurora and summoned up my most charming smile. And what about you, Defender Solana? The Ignis mage pursed her lips as she considered me. I knew she was still struggling with all this. So much had happened and changed in the last few weeks, and Abris's betrayal happened only days ago. Now we were in a new kingdom, a kingdom overrun by bandits, no less, and we were in search of an evil mastermind that seemed to be aiming for the destruction of the entire realm. Add in all this crazy that I had just dropped in her lap, and I realized it was a lot for the half-elf to handle. I opened my mouth to try once more at persuasion, but Aurora surprised me. Between one breath and the next, she darted forward and caught my lips with her own. My mouth opened easily under the gentle pressure, and then our tongues twined together in a familiar dance. I groaned quietly against her mouth as my dick twitched in my unlaced breeches.
I am with you, Mason.
Aurora breathed as she pulled away.
Though it might take me a few days to process all of this fully, Kayla is right. You are a good man, with a good heart, and I would not be here if it were not for you. So, I forgive you for your slight deception, and I thank you for your honesty.
I am so incredibly lucky to have the two of you, I whispered as a relieved grin spread across my face.
Yes, you are,
Another voice said behind me. I whirled around and nearly fell over in the process. Kayla gasped and clutched the covers close to her again, while Aurora vaulted to her feet and reached for the sword she had propped against the wall beside the bed. Nemris stood in the center of the room with an enigmatic smile on her face and her hands folded into the billowy sleeves of her royal purple robe. It was strange to see her in the daylight. She seemed more solid somehow, less ethereal. Her skin didn't give off as much of an inner glow, and she stood with her bare feet planted firmly on the worn and wooden planks of the Prairie Inn. Her eyes, though, still eddied with 1,000 swirling cosmos, flaring nebulas, and collapsing stars.
Who are you?
Aurora demanded as she brandished her wicked silver sword.
How did you get in here?
The half-elf stood with her feet hips-width apart and her chin lifted high, as if she didn't even notice or care that she was completely and utterly nude. "Aurora, it's okay," I said as I raised my hands in a soothing gesture. "She's not an enemy. I know her." The Ignis mage glanced at me with a scowl, like she was going to demand how I knew this insanely gorgeous woman, but then I watched as understanding sparked in her emerald eyes. "Yes," I nodded to confirm her suspicion. "This is Nemris, the goddess of peace and transition." Aurora looked back to the silver-haired woman, and her mouth fell open at the same time that she dropped her arm to her side. She dragged her eyes up from Nemris's white feet and took the goddess in. When she reached the cosmic eyes, the half-elf blanched.
My apologies."
Aurora stuttered as she immediately bowed her head. Then she noticed that she was, in fact, naked in front of an actual deity, and she wrapped her arms tight across her chest as her cheeks burned red.
No apologies necessary,
Nemris replied with a warm smile.
It gladdens me to see that Mason is so well protected.
Aurora nodded silently as she cast her eyes about furiously for clothes. Kayla still sat on the bed, her jaw in her lap and her ice-blue eyes as round as the full moon. Please excuse my lovely companions," I said to Nemris as I stood to my feet. "They've received quite a few shocks this morning, and all before breakfast, too."
I know,
Nemris responded.
I have been watching.
"You have?" I asked as I tilted my head to the side.
I always have an eye on you, Mason.
The goddess chuckled, and the sound sent a shiver of pleasure down my spine. "Wait," I said with a frown. "But why are you here now?" Nemris cocked an eyebrow, and a smirk tugged at her lips.
Do you mean now instead of 5 minutes ago, so I could have made your confession easier?
"What? No!" I sputtered as blood rushed to my cheeks. I had been thinking precisely that. "I mean—" The goddess threw back her head and laughed, and her silver hair spilled over her shoulders like a waterfall of starlight.
I jest, my love. You have always been quite adorable when you are flustered.
"Thank you," I said as I rubbed at the hot skin on the back of my neck.
You are welcome.
Nemris replied with a grin.
However, to answer your question, I am here because there are things you need to know about your new abilities, and it would be better if you knew this before you traveled deeper into this kingdom. Now that your companions know the truth of who you are, I saw no reason to push this meeting any longer.
"Is something coming?" I asked as my heart skipped a beat. "Are we in danger?"
You have been in danger since the moment you opened your eyes in this realm, my love.
The goddess sighed, and then she reached up and cupped my cheek.
However, in almost every life, you always seem to find trouble. It is a unique talent of yours. This is why I have given you these powers, to protect yourself and the ones you love.
But from who? I questioned. Who is this master? Why are these attacks happening?
I do not have the time to explain all of that.
Nemrys said, and a small frown marred her beautiful face.
I can only inhabit the mortal plane for so long, and then I must depart again for my own domain.
I sighed and raked my fingers through my hair. Of course you do, because things can never be that easy.
Life never promised to be easy,
the goddess remarked. True, I muttered, and then I exhaled sharply and clapped my hands together. All right, so what did you need to tell me? What can these new powers do?
Well, you have already seen the end result,
Nemrys replied as her smile returned. Then she stepped past me and around to the other side of the bed where Kayla still sat gobsmacked before she bent down and plucked the little stick man from the princess's lap. So, I can make stickmen? I said with a frown.
You can do so much more than that,
the goddess responded as she ran her finger over the little stick figure.
But this is a cute first attempt.
Does that mean I can bring anything to life? I asked as my blood started to pump with excitement.
Within reason,
Nemrys corrected.
As is the way of things, there is always a price. The larger things are, the more energy they will consume. You will need to find alternative solutions to fuel your larger creations.
Okay, I said with a nod. That makes sense. But can I control the things I bring to life, or communicate with them at least? I had so many questions running through my head, but I did my best to pick out the most important ones.
You are connected to everything your magic touches,
the goddess replied as she reached out and laid her free hand over my heart.
When your power rushes out of you, it brings with it your intention and will. Larger tasks will take more focus and concentration, but for something small like this little creature, a mere thought will suffice. In fact, you have already done this.
I blinked. I have? Nemrys nodded, and her smile grew as she looked back at the stickman in her palm.
When you breathed life into him, your subconscious prayed that he would endear your companions to you. And what was the first thing he did?
He immediately tried to reach Aurora and Kayla, I said in awe. Wait, so he was trying to calm them? For me?
Yes,
the goddess intoned. Then she reached out, picked up my hand, and slid the stick figure into my palm.
He's connected to you, Mason. To fully harness your abilities, you must hone this connection.
I looked down at the little stick man, and he lifted his round silver head to gaze back up at me, even though he had no eyes. I smiled at him and then decided to test my powers a bit. I sent out a minuscule tendril of magic and imagined what I wanted the stick figure to do. Then I held up a single finger a hair's breadth away from his head. A moment later, the stickman lifted his paper clip of an arm and high-fived my fingertip. That is so cool! I laughed, and then I lifted my eyes back to Nemrys, only to discover that she had disappeared once again. Aurora and Kayla gaped at me.
Where did she go?
The Ignis mage asked as she whipped her head back and forth.
She was there, and then I blinked and she was gone.
She does that, I explained with a shrug. You'll have to get used to it.
It seems I have a lot to get used to,
the half-elf muttered. Then she exhaled sharply and collapsed back onto the bed, still naked as the day she was born. Kayla bounced a little amidst the blankets as Aurora settled beside her. Her expression was still completely dazed. Are you all right? I asked as I reached out and stroked her ink-black hair.
Yet to be determined,
the princess mumbled back as she blinked in rapid succession.
I do have one question, though.
Shoot, I replied as my stickman began to clamber up my wrist. Kayla lifted her head, looked me dead in the eye, and asked,
In your previous lives, did you sleep with that goddess?
Heat flooded my cheeks, and I scrubbed sheepishly at the beard on my cheek. Well, yes? Apparently, we had some grand love affair, but don't worry. She's on the same page the three of us are on. What I mean is that she's not the jealous type.
Oh, good.
Kayla said as she closed her eyes and flopped back to lie on the bed beside Aurora.
I do not think I can fight a goddess and win.
Aurora snorted next to her and opened her mouth to add something, but before she could say a word, there was a loud knock at the door. Yes? I called out as I grabbed my pistol. Morning, Serlo called as he pushed the door open. I was wondering, we are naked! I shouted, since it was the truth, but I also didn't want him to come in and see my stick man walking around. Oops, sorry, Serlo quickly grunted, and then he swung the door closed again. Just wondering if you folks were wanting some breakfast. No rush or nothing, though. We'll be down in a moment, I called through the door. Thanks. Welcome, the bartender coughed, and then we listened to his heavy footsteps clop back down the stairs. I turned and looked back at Aurora and Kayla. The three of us stared at each other for a long and silent moment, and then we burst out laughing in unison.
This certainly has been a day.
Kayla gasped between bouts of laughter.
And we have not even made it out of bed yet.
I try to keep things as exciting as possible, I replied with a roguish grin. But before I rend your reality even further, why don't we go down and see if Serlo has some eggs? I don't mean to brag, but I make a mean omelet. I paused for dramatic effect and waggled my eyebrows. You might even call it divine. Aurora groaned at the bad pun and tossed a pillow at my head. Chapter 4. By noon we were fed, packed, and ready to depart from the town of Keld. Yeah, sure you don't want to stay one more night? Serlo asked as he walked us out of the Prairie Inn. You did a lot of work yesterday. Don't your body need more rest? I'll be fine, I assured the bartender with a grin. I bounced back pretty quickly. In fact, I barely even feel sore today. To prove my point, I jogged in place and shadowboxed for a moment. I wasn't lying. My body did feel great this morning. I didn't know if it was Nemris's doing or just getting a good night's sleep after an honest day's work protecting the people of Cetus. Either way, I felt like I could run to Aiden at this point. All right, Serlo chuckled as he dodged my playful jabs. I ain't fixin' to fight you. Don't want you keeling over on down the road.
We'll be sure to keep him upright,
Aurora replied as she tossed her blue hair over her shoulder.
Do not worry. We are well versed in saving Mason from himself.
Kayla giggled on the other side of the half-elf, but then she quickly dropped her head again when she realized how many people had gathered around Bobby 2.0 20 feet in front of us. Serlo squinted sidelong at the princess for a moment, as if he was still trying to place her. We couldn't have that, so I chuckled loudly and turned to Aurora to draw the bartender's attention. What would I do without you? I said as I slung my arm over the Ignis Mage's shoulder.
You would fall on your ass a lot,
Aurora replied, and a smirk tugged at her mouth. And I wouldn't even have anyone to kiss it better, I shot back with a wide grin. That sounds like a terrible way to live. The half-elf rolled her eyes, but then she pressed herself against my side and wrapped her arm around my back.
I guess that means we are stuck with each other.
Guess so, I said, and then I bent down and pressed a kiss to the top of her blue head. I think I'm okay with that, though. Aurora squeezed my hip, but didn't respond as we drew up to the crowd that surrounded our bike. Out of the way, you rubbernecks, Serlo groused as he waved his arms at his fellow townsfolk. These followed Bobby's seat and turned around to face them. She has been nothing. That ain't no horse. You'll see. Serlo glanced back at me and cocked an eyebrow.
Aren't you forgetting something, Mason?
Her arms over her chest. I was actually talking to Bobby, I said with a wink. But good to know you're ready, too. Aurora rolled her eyes and swung her leg over the bike. She scooted forward as I slid in behind her, and then I felt Kayla's arms wrap around my waist as she took the last seat. "All right, fire her up," I declared as I hooked my chin over Aurora's shoulder. The half-elf glanced back at me and cocked an eyebrow.
Aren't you forgetting something, Mason?
Then her eyes drifted down pointedly to the stone that encased the rear tire. "Oops," I replied as I summoned up a little magic. "My bad." The rock shuddered around the metallic wheel before it cracked open like an egg. The two halves of the stone fell away from the tire, and I willed it to return to dirt. A moment later, the ground was smooth and unblemished beneath us, like nothing had ever happened. "Take two," I chuckled. "Let's try that again." Aurora turned back around to my face. Damn, did I love that sound. Her hand to place it over the ignition port. I felt the static of her magic zap to Aurora, and a 2.0 shot forward over the dirt, and then we tore down the road as dust billowed in our wake. The people of Keld were smart enough to keep close to the buildings as we flew past. The great wall that I had constructed and the gate quickly rushed toward us. Atop the wall, I saw several men scramble to pull the huge wooden double doors open, and they slowly, very slowly began to scrape across the dirt.
Mason, I think you should slow down,
Kayla called over the roar of the wind. Aurora began to lessen her fire output, but I reached down and squeezed her hip. "Don't," I told the Ignis Mage. "We'll make it. The doors are almost open." The half-elf didn't respond, but Bobby regained her speed beneath us, and we rocketed towards the gates of Keld. The empty space between them was maybe 2 feet wide, but beyond, I caught a glimpse of blue sky and green fields. With a grin, I revved the engine harder.
Mason!
Kayla yelled again, and her voice rose in pitch as she dragged my name out.
We're going to crash!
"No, we won't!" I shouted back as her arms tightened like boa constrictors around my ribs. "Trust me!" Kayla whimpered and buried her face in my back. Aurora seemed to trust me, though, because the engine did not falter as we came within 20 yards of the gates. I glanced in the side mirror and saw that a wild smile was plastered across the half-elf's face. Then I lifted my head and saw that the gap between the gates had widened to about 4 feet wide. The men along the wall above us shouted down warnings, but there was no need. I gunned the engine. Kayla screamed behind me, but then we tore through the gap between the gates with inches to spare. "Hell yeah!" I shouted to the sky, and Aurora let out her own fierce and triumphant cry.
Do not do that ever again!
Kayla yelled in my ear. "Yes, Your Highness!" I laughed, and then we soared down the open road deeper into Cetus. We drove for several hours, but came across no new towns. There were only farms and homesteads along the distant horizon, and fields. Endless fields of grass and wheat and corn and other crops I couldn't identify as we pushed 50 miles an hour. In the middle of the afternoon, we pulled over under a copse of thin trees to stretch our legs and eat some of Serlo's provisions. I sat down with my back against a tree trunk, and Aurora and Kayla knelt to the ground opposite me. The princess dug through the saddlebags and then passed out a ration of meat, bread, and hard cheese. "Thank you," I said, my eyes locked on the food, but then Kayla let out a high-pitched gasp. I jerked my head up, and my fingers twitched toward my revolver, but I only found Kayla grinning down into her hand at the small silver stick figure. "Don't do that," I grumbled as I rubbed at my pounding heart.
Sorry,
she apologized as she turned to face me fully.
I forgot he was in there. He startled me.
The little stick man waddled across her hand and then sort of fell onto his butt on the edge of her palm. After Nemrus had departed this morning, I had considered rendering the stick figure lifeless again, but Kayla and Aurora had taken a shine to him, and it also felt a little rude to bring the little guy to life and essentially kill him twice in 2 days. So I stowed him in my saddlebags with the rest of our supplies, and in the rush of leaving Keld, he had slipped my mind.
How is something with no facial characteristics so cute?
Aurora said with a warm smile as she leaned forward and ran her finger across the stickman's bearing ball-shaped head.
We should give him a name,
Kayla replied excitedly, and she looked up at me with a grin. You think? I chuckled as I peered at the stick figure.
Absolutely.
The princess nodded firmly. All right then, I said with a grin, and I held out my hand for the little guy. Let me see him. Kayla slid him into my hand, and he craned his smooth silver head to look up into my face. I held up my fingertip and sent out a little burst of magic again as I racked my brain for a suitable name. The stickman lifted his arm in response to my power's call, and he executed another perfect high five. I rubbed at the top of his head in praise. What about Stan? I suggested as the idea struck me.
Stan?
Kayla echoed, and when I looked up, her face was scrunched in distaste.
That is not a very cute name.
Oh, come on, I cajoled with a grin. He's a little steel man. Steel man, Stan. It's funny.
You and your wordplay.
Aurora teased with a roll of her eyes, but her lips twitched upward with amusement. What do you think, Stan? I asked as I looked down at the stick figure. Do you like that name? I sent out another little tendril of magic, and a moment later he bobbed his head in a nod. He likes it, I said as I looked back to Kayla. The princess sighed and bowed her head.
Then Stan it is, I guess.
Hooray! I cheered, and Stan jumped a centimeter off my palm in response to my happy and swirling magic.
Now that Stan is settled,
Aurora said as she reached for her food again.
I think it is time we eat.
Hear, hear, I agreed, and I set Stan on my knee as I picked up my parcel of lunch. You know, I added a moment later as I chewed on a piece of dried and salted prairie dog meat, this isn't as bad as I thought it would be. It's actually pretty tasty.
It's a little gamey,
Kayla said as she wrinkled her delicate nose. Her piece of sod poodle was barely more than a sliver, and it looked like she had substituted it with a larger piece of bread.
I've had worse,
Aurora remarked with a shrug, and then she dug her teeth into a piece of meat and washed it down with a swig of water. I'm sure the palace cooks will fix us up something more appetizing when we reach Aten, Princess Balmier, I teased with a grin. The raven-haired maiden pursed her lips and set her food down on a piece of cloth beside her.
Actually, I wanted to speak to you about that, about reaching Aten.
What about it? I asked with a frown. Kayla sighed and then turned to dig through our saddlebags again. A moment later, she withdrew a folded piece of parchment that she then spread out on the grass between us.
I do not think we should stay on the main road for the rest of our journey,
the princess said as we bent our heads over what I realized was a map of Cetus.
There are several large towns between us and the capital, and if Keld is any indication, I suspect most, if not all of them, will be overrun with bandits. So what do you suggest?
Aurora asked with a tilt of her head.
We should take the back roads,
the princess replied, and then she pointed to a series of faint, barely discernible lines on her map that wound through the plains and hills of the kingdom.
The terrain is a little rougher, and it would add a few hours to our total travel time, but the back roads are less traveled, which means that bandits probably won't use them much either, since there are fewer people to pillage and plunder.
Her face twisted into a dark scowl as she said this, and she clenched her fist atop the map until the paper crinkled. I reached out and wrapped my hand around hers. Then, as if he already sensed what I wanted, Stan hopped off my knee, waddled over to our overlapped hands, and patted gently at the princess's knuckles. Kayla blinked as if she came out of a daze, and her fist unclenched beneath my palm. No offense, I said gently as I looked into Kayla's deep blue eyes. But doesn't that mean we should stay on the main road? It's the people in the towns that need our help.
I know,
the princess responded, and genuine pain shone in her face.
And I want nothing more than to help the mason, you know this. The suffering is why I came and found you, but...
But what? I prompted when she trailed off into silence. Kayla sighed.
But we could spend days upon days rooting out the bandits, searching for Camus Dread, and repairing every town from here to Ayton. Under any other circumstances, I would spend every waking hour doing just that. But we have bigger issues at stake. The longer it takes for us to reach my father, the longer it takes for us to investigate the strange attacks that brought us together. The more time this master has to regroup and plan his next attack, whatever that may be.
I frowned as I considered her words. As much as I wanted to deny it, she was right. Whoever this master asshole was, he wasn't good news. I remembered the manic light in Abris's eyes as the Lux Mage spoke of him, and I also recalled Nemeris's warning the night of the feast. She called him a formidable adversary. Coming from a goddess, that sure as hell was cause for concern. I sighed heavily and scrubbed at the beard on my cheeks. You're right, Kayla. This master mystery takes priority, but I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers harshly into the sockets. I don't like the idea of abandoning all those people to the likes of Camus Dread.
I hate it too,
The princess replied softly as she leaned forward and pried my hands away from my face. Spots of various colors danced before my eyes, and I squinted to focus on Kayla's face. I'm sorry. This has to feel shitty for you too, even more so, I can imagine.
My father is not the only one who has lost sleep.
She whispered as she averted her eyes.
Nor is he the only one sickened by what has befallen our home.
I leaned forward, cupped her delicate chin, and tilted her face back toward me. We'll find a way to help everyone. I promise.
How?
Kayla asked, and her ice-blue eyes shone with unshed tears. I don't know exactly yet, I admitted, but I'll try anything and everything. Kayla smiled weakly.
You always have a plan, Mason, don't you?
I'm the man with the plan, I replied with a grin, and a couple dozen ideas for new weapons I can't wait to try out on bandits and evil mysterious bastards alike.
New weapons?
Aurora piped up, and she leaned forward with bright eyes.
Like what? Have you made any prototypes yet?
Ever the warrior looking for new toys, I teased the half-elf. And seeing as I was busy up until the moment we left Ilaria, and given the fact that we've been driving for 2 days, no, I haven't made anything yet.
Oh.
The half-elf deflated and sat back on the grass again. Sorry to disappoint, I chuckled, but I do have some designs. I turned and dug around in the saddlebags myself for a moment, and then I extracted my own leaflets of parchment. They're not as detailed as Elias's, I warned as I handed Aurora the schematics, but I'll figure out the logistics when we reach Ayton and I have the space and materials to work with. The half-elf studied the sketches that I had thrown together.
On the plate to get the Dodgers game.
together whenever I had a spare moment in the last week. Her eyebrows knitted together as she considered the illustration on the first page.
Does this weapon break in half?
She asked in bewilderment. That's called a top-break revolver, I replied with a grin. There's a hinge that twists on the bottom.
Why?
Aurora questioned as she tilted her head and brought the page closer to her face. So I can reload faster, I explained. Right now I have to load the bullets and eject the casings from my revolver one by one. With a top break or even a full double action piece, though that will take a little bit more planning and experimentation to make, I can load and eject all 6 at once. It's much more efficient, especially when we take on Chemist Dread or this master character. Aurora pursed her lips and looked up into my eyes.
And these are all things from your other world, correct?
I winced and then nodded. Yes, guns were a common human invention in my world. They've been around for hundreds of years. The revolver and rifle I've already made are archaic models, some of the first that were made. Not as efficient or deadly, but a little easier to put together with limited resources. The more modern and larger types in my world could rapidly fire nearly 1,000 bullets a minute. The Ignis Mage's eyes went wide, and then she glanced back at my schematics.
Your world sounds like a dangerous place.
It was, I replied with a solemn nod of my head. But I'm here now, and I plan to make the most of it. I'm not only planning to make guns once I have some more ore on my hands.
What else were you thinking of?
Kayla questioned, and I looked over to find Stan, cupped in the princess's hand once again. Well, for starters, I want to give Bobby some upgrades, I said with a grin as I leaned over and patted my bike on her warm side. Then, I think I should give Stan some brothers, don't you? Well, maybe cousins. I don't think we need any more stickmen, but who knows what else I can bring to life. I feel like Dr. Frankenstein. Aurora and Kayla looked equally puzzled by the unrestrained glee in my voice.
Who?
The half-elf asked with a frown. I waved my hand dismissively. He's a man in a story from my world, not important. What is important is us getting back on the road now, because I'm pumped to test what else my magic can do. I jumped to my feet with a flourish as my heart pounded wildly beneath my ribs and my magic eddied excitedly through my veins. Then I held a hand out to the women still seated in the grass. Are you with me, ladies? I asked with a roguish smile. Kayla took my hand as she returned my grin, and I easily pulled her up and against me. The princess giggled against my collarbone.
It seems your enthusiasm is infectious, Mason,
the raven-haired beauty remarked. Then she lifted her hand to show me how Stan was jumping up and down in her palm, which was quite a feat, since he didn't have knees. I made a mental note to look into upgrades for Stan later, too. It seemed he had somehow become a part of our little ragtag team. He deserved a little TLC. Stan knows awesomeness awaits us on the horizon, I chuckled.
Is that what it is?
Aurora asked as she shielded her eyes against the sun and squinted into the distance.
I thought that was more scrub brush.
Come on, I cajoled as I wrapped my arm around the half-elf's waist and tugged her up against my other side. Aren't you just a little bit excited? Aurora rolled her eyes again, but her smirk betrayed her.
Just be careful of that growing head of yours,
she remarked as she reached up and tousled my hair. I pouted, but then the Ignis Mage rose onto her tiptoes and pressed a warm kiss to my cheek. Not one to miss an opportunity, Kayla did the same on my other side, and I sighed with contentment. Being sandwiched between and kissed by 2 insanely hot women wasn't a bad way to go through life.
Aiden awaits us,
Kayla whispered in my ear, and then she pulled away and moved back over to Bobby. The princess lifted her hand and pecked a gentle kiss against Stan's head before she bent down and stowed him once again in the saddlebags. We packed up quickly after that, and within 10 minutes we had started up Bobby again and were pulling back onto the road. Kayla had pointed out the paths we needed to take before we had disembarked, and when we encountered the first side road half an hour later, I steered Bobby to the left, and we rumbled onto rougher terrain. The side road was little more than a dirt inlet into the heart of the prairie. The metallic studs that wrapped around Bobby's wheels tore into the hard-packed ground and kicked up a cloud of dust in our wake. I squinted into the debris for a moment, and then I sent out a small burst of magic. The dust cloud scattered around us, and I kept up a constant, if negligible, stream of power to clear our way. As we rode deeper and deeper into the desert country, the only life we encountered were the soaring birds above our heads. The roar of the engine had faded into the background, and as we coasted, I found myself tuning out. I basked in the warm sun that arched toward the western horizon, and I leaned back into the solid presence of Kayla wrapped around me. For a moment, just a moment, I could let myself believe I was back on Earth. The Midwest open before me, no bandits gunning for our blood, no mysterious and evil master plotting our demise. I was just on a Sunday drive with the women I loved, and we were happy. We were safe. Which, of course, is when something went wrong. It happened between one moment and the next. I was sitting there enjoying the languid rush of the moment, and then my magic snapped to attention inside of me. At first it hummed beneath my skin like a tuning fork, a low but steady vibration, but then the frequency and urgency increased until it felt like I had a siren blaring inside my head. My eyes refocused on the dirt road before us, and I scanned for any threats that could set me on edge like this, but the country was as empty and barren as ever. Just the usual tall grasses and scrub brush waved back to me. Still, I couldn't ignore this feeling. "Stop the bike," I called to Aurora as I squeezed her hip. The half-elf glanced over her shoulder, her brow furrowed in confusion, but I let off the accelerator and gently began to apply the brake. "Stop," I repeated, and this time the Ignis Mage listened. I steered the bike to the edge of the road, and a moment later Aurora killed the engine.
What is it?
Kayla asked as I lowered the kickstand.
What's wrong?
"I'm not sure," I replied as I lifted my head and scanned our surroundings again with a critical eye. I started to get a bad feeling. My magic was going haywire.
Is it still?
Aurora questioned as she turned in her seat to study me. I paused for a moment to assess. "It's not as bad as when we were moving, but the edge is still there. It feels like a warning." Aurora frowned sharply and whipped her head around in search of impending threats. Her emerald eyes dilated in the bright sunlight, and she squinted her powerful gaze into the distance.
I do not see anything.
The half-elf announced a moment later.
Nor do I smell or hear anybody within 100-yard radius.
"Are you sure?" I asked as I released the handlebars and rubbed at my sternum. My chest feels sore from how hard my heart's beating, and my magic feels like angry snakes writhing through my veins. It's trying to tell me something.
Can you determine what exactly it is trying to say?
Aurora questioned. "No," I responded as I shook my head. "It's just like an alarm going off."
Try harder.
The Ignis Mage replied as her brows formed a sharp V over her eyes.
Close your eyes and focus. Your magic is an extension of yourself. Listen closely.
"Okay, I'll try," I said with a nod, and then I closed my eyes to follow the half-elf's instructions. At first, I couldn't pinpoint anything. My magic just whirled inside of me like a maelstrom, agitated and untamable. But then I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly as I willed myself to calm down. Slowly but surely, my power began to untangle itself like vines unraveling. The vague sense of danger and urgency became clearer and more focused. I inhaled sharply, and then I let all my mental walls come crashing down, and my magic flowed out of me like a tidal wave. It rushed forward along the dirt road, and it sent me back shadowed impressions of what lay before us. I could feel the way the earth breathed and moved, the way the rocks slid together, the way the ground had composed itself. For a 20-yard radius, nothing stood out to me. Everything was normal. But then, I found it. I snapped open my eyes with a grunt, and anger swirled with my power to make the dirt beneath us quake.
Mason?
Kayla asked as she reached out and laid a hand on my arm.
What is it?
Booby trap, I replied through gritted teeth.
Where?
Aurora questioned sharply, and the half-elf leaned to the side of the bike to grasp her sword that was strapped to the frame. I lifted my right arm, splayed my fingers wide, and set out a small shockwave of magic. It rushed forward like a dirt devil across the plains, and then 30 yards ahead of us, the road gave way with a sharp crack, and dust billowed into the sky in the shape of a mushroom cloud. Kayla gasped and clenched my elbow tightly. Aurora's frown only deepened.
Do you think it is an ambush?
The half-elf asked me out of the side of her mouth. I don't know, I replied as I glanced across the prairie again. The fields were flat and endless around us. There aren't many places to hide.
And I still do not sense anyone,
Aurora added as she pursed her lips. Then she caught a sidelong glance at me.
Think it is safe for us to move forward?
I think it's our only option unless we want to go back to the main road, I replied grimly. Keep your eyes peeled for any movement or signs of life.
Understood.
Aurora responded with a nod, and then she turned back around and started the engine again.
Careful,
Kayla whispered in my ear as we began to creep forward. Always am, I said lightly, and I tried to throw a smile over my shoulder, but it probably came out more like a grimace. We inched along the dirt road as we approached the site of the still settling dust. I sent out another burst of magic, and then the dust fell back to the earth all at once, like a hazy rain, as we came to a stop again. When the air had cleared, Aurora cursed, and Kayla inhaled sharply. There before us was a pit, about 10 feet wide and maybe 15 feet deep. The fall alone would probably be enough to injure someone permanently, but it looked like the bandits didn't want to take any chances, because the bottom of the pit was also lined with jagged, wooden stakes nearly as tall as I was. Some of them were stained darkly along the tips. That looks like blood, I observed as I gestured to the stains. It seems like someone wasn't as lucky as we are.
This is awful,
Kayla remarked quietly at my back, and her arms trembled around my waist. Serlo said the bandits had set booby traps, I gently reminded the princess. Good thing it was in the earth. That was probably why I sensed it.
What I do not understand is why they set this here and then abandoned it,
Aurora said with a frown. I rubbed at my chin as I gave it some thought. Well, Kayla did say the back roads are less traveled. Maybe it wasn't lucrative enough for the bandits to man this trap.
So they just left it here when they decided to take over the towns?
Kayla questioned, and there was a new note of steel in her voice.
They completely abandoned this deadly disaster to maim and kill indiscriminately?
Maybe, I replied as another thought occurred to me. Or maybe it's like a hunting trap.
What do you mean?
Aurora asked as she tilted her head. I mean, maybe they set this trap like hunters set snares, I explained. The towns are more lucrative, like you said, but I bet bandits aren't ones to pass on free and easy money. Perhaps they leave these traps like this to catch, maim, and incapacitate their victims. Then they return like scavengers to collect the loot once the people are dead or too injured to fight back.
Bastards.
Aurora seethed as she bared her teeth. Kayla vibrated behind me, and at first I thought it was from fear, but then she spoke.
Camistrid is a dead man,
the princess hissed, and her voice cracked with rage.
I swear this upon my kingdom. I will see this man dead if I have to take his life with my own 2 hands.
As satisfying as that would be, I replied darkly as I reached down and brushed my revolver. I plan on pumping the prick with as much lead as I can find. The 3 of us sat there for a silent moment and stared into the pit, dark thoughts of vengeance and bloodshed whirling around our heads.
What should we do?
Aurora finally asked as the wind picked up and blew dust back into the air. Well, as much as I'd like to hang around and personally meet the architects of this fine structure, I muttered, we still need to get to Aiden, and I'm not comfortable with the idea of sleeping in the middle of open bandit country tonight.
So, we continue on?
Kayla questioned, and I could hear a note of disappointment in her voice. We continue on, I echoed with a nod, but we'll make quick pit stops along the way.
To do what?
Aurora asked as she glanced at me. In response, I lifted my arm again and summoned up my magic. It rushed forth in a deluge, fueled by my anger, and a moment later the ground started to rumble beneath our feet. Then, a loud groan filled the air, followed by multiple sharp cracks as rock and dirt rushed into the pit and shattered the stakes into splinters. A minute later, the road was smooth and unblemished before us, like the hole had never been there. I can't in good conscience leave these traps for other people to fall prey to, I replied as I lowered my arm. I'll have my magic scan the road ahead of us for more, and I'll disarm and fix the ones I can as we continue our journey to Aiden.
And once we reach the capital?
Kayla questioned as she leaned forward to see my face.
What then, Mason?
Then, we meet with your father and start planning our assault, I replied as I clenched my hands along the handlebars and my knuckles blanched white. They might not know it yet, but I'm coming for both Camus Dread and this master, and I'm not going to stop until I have both their heads mounted to the front of Bobby, one on top of the other. Chapter 5. In total, we found and disabled more than a dozen booby traps along the back roads as we made our way to Aiden. There were several more pits, a handful of tripwires that triggered either a spear or an arrow, and even a few actual snares, as if we were nothing but easy prey, little more than animals to these bandits. With each trap that we disarmed, the anger in my chest grew hotter, like a steadily building wildfire. I could see the flames reflected in Aurora and Kayla's eyes, too. The half-elf gnashed her teeth and cursed as we filled in pits and unwound ropes. The princess, on the other hand, became quieter and quieter as we went, and I couldn't help but feel like it was the quiet before the storm. Wherever Camus Dread was, he had no idea that when we got a hold of him, he was going to wish for a pit filled with stakes. "How much farther to Aiden?" I asked as we undid yet another snare. The sun had dipped low during our hours of riding and secret good deeds. By now, the sky was streaked with reds and oranges, and flocks of birds cut across the horizon as they returned to their roosts. I estimated we had less than an hour of sunlight left.
We are about 20 miles outside of the capital,
Kayla replied as she tugged the bandit's snare from around a tree branch.
Normally I would say we still had a half a day's ride, but with Bobby...
The princess trailed off with a shrug, and then she turned back to the rope as she worked to wind it around her arm. "I think we can make it within the hour," I mused as I did the math in my head. "Probably just as it gets full dark. Will that be a problem?" Again, Kayla shrugged.
There is only a single gate around Aiden, and it used to be kept open both day and night. However, in my absence, my father might have imposed a curfew or even barred the gates entirely to keep out Camus Dread. I have no way to be sure what we might face until the city comes into view. Then we had best make haste,"
Aurora remarked as she came to stand beside Kayla.
On top of issues we might face at the gates, I also do not think it would be wise for us to travel at night. It leaves us too vulnerable to attack. Plus, the road itself will be more treacherous, even with Mason's magic and my enhanced eyesight.
"Not to mention we're all pretty worn out," I muttered as I cracked my neck from side to side. While the journey itself had been less dangerous than our first day in Cetus, Aurora and I had spent a good deal of magic since we left the town of Keld. The Ignis mage had powered us through the countryside, while I had acted as our danger scanner. The tasks themselves required lower levels of energy than, say, building a giant wall, but after nearly 8 hours of consistent output, my body had begun to feel sore, like I had run all this way instead of perched on Bobby's seat. Aurora sighed and rubbed tiredly at her temples.
"You are not wrong there. I can get us the rest of the way to Aten, but once there I will need to eat almost immediately. Something other than sod poodle, preferably. My father will most likely insist on a feast.
Kayla said as she finished coiling the length of rope around her arm.
There will be more than enough for us to replenish ourselves. Perfect.
Aurora all but moaned, and then she held her hand out to Kayla.
Here, I'll take care of that now. Thank you.
The princess replied with a small smile as she passed the rope over to the Ignis mage. A moment later I felt the zap of Aurora's magic, and then the rope in her hands caught fire. The orange flames quickly devoured the frayed cord until gray ash shifted through the half-elf's fingers and fluttered to the ground. I sighed as Aurora dropped her hand. I wish we didn't have to burn all this rope. Some of it was still pretty sturdy.
We've been over this, Mason,
the blue-haired maiden remarked as she clapped her hands together to rid them of soot.
There is no room in our saddlebags, and if we leave it, the bandits will just remake the traps.
I know, but still, I replied. Waste not, want not, and all that good stuff. And growing up, I never threw anything away unless it completely broke or fell to pieces.
If it makes you feel any better,
the half-elf said with a smirk.
The next length of rope you find, you can recycle it as a noose when we finally catch Camish Dread or the Master, whichever comes first.
I like the sound of that, I responded with a sharp grin, though I'm still partial to pumping them both full of lead.
Why not both?
Kayla muttered darkly as she perched herself on the back of Bobby's seat.
One punishment doesn't seem enough for the likes of them.
You are absolutely right, my lady, I said as I strode over and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Once we get to Aten, we'll make an ordered list of exactly how we want these bastards to pay. How does that sound? Kayla looked up at me and smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was as sharp as jagged glass along the edges, and her eyes were as cold and cruel as deep winter back in Chicago.
That sounds lovely,
the princess whispered, and I suppressed a shudder. Camish Dread and this master should hope I find them first. I might want to make them suffer, but the dark promises in Kayla's eyes would make even the hardest, toughest, most evil men shit their pants. Then let's race that sunset, I said as Aurora joined us beside the bike.
I have always been fond of a good race,
the Ignis mage remarked, and then she swung her leg over Bobby's seat, placed her hand on the ignition port, and started the engine. And I have always been fond of winning, I replied with a broad grin as I slid in behind Aurora and grabbed hold of the handlebars. Kayla sat down quickly at my back and wrapped her incredibly long limbs around me.
I am fond of remaining in one piece, so please be careful and do not pull any more stunts like the one you performed at the gates of Keld.
Yes, your highness, I drawled as I cast a wink over my shoulder. The princess narrowed her eyes, but before she could retort, I cranked back the throttle, and we sped off into the rapidly approaching twilight. By some bizarre stroke of luck, we encountered no more booby traps on the last leg of our journey. Perhaps it was because we were so close to the capital now, and by extension, the only armed men the King of Cetus had on retainer. I wasn't sure how many soldiers were in the royal guard, but I guessed that Camish Dread didn't want to bother tangling with them, not when there were much easier places to target and conquer. Either way, I welcomed the respite as we raced along the back roads, and the sun continued its descent toward the western horizon. As the world slipped into twilight, the warm summer air dropped a few degrees, and I thanked Nemrus and all the could-be gods for the blessed cool breeze that whipped at my cheeks and raised goosebumps along my arms. I tipped my head back to look at the sky, and I marveled at the millions of unfamiliar stars and galaxies that greeted me. In the wake of all the bloodshed and violence of the past few days, it felt good to remind myself that there was so much beauty and mystery in this new world for me to see. I vowed right then and there that I would not let the likes of Abras or Camish Dread or this master ruin the fact that I had been gifted an amazing life here, in this glorious realm, with power untold in my veins and a beautiful woman on each arm. This was my home now, and I planned to fight like hell to protect and save it. About half an hour later, the small dirt trail we had followed through the country suddenly cut right and merged back with the main road. The terrain was a little more hilly here, not as flat and uniform, and the land fell and rose beneath us gently as we approached the city of Aten. The capital itself sat atop a small knoll, and it rose up out of the landscape solemn, smaller than Sarin, but still majestic in its own way. I could see the king's castle rise up from the city's center, and its spires and towers pierced the bruised purple sky. The rest of Aten was shielded by a large stone wall, and torches shone along its parapets. To the left of the capital was a wide lake, and the placid water reflected the last of the sun's dying rays, and it looked like the prairie had been set on fire. It was a beautiful sight, and a new resolve settled along the stiff line of my spine as I reaffirmed my promise to make Camus dread and all evil bastards pay for bringing death and suffering to a kingdom as amazing as this. Kayla clenched her arms tight around me as she gazed upon her home for the first time in months, and I only wished I could see the expression on her face. I settled for squeezing Aurora's hip as I signaled her to give Bobby everything she had, and then I gunned the throttle so that we leapt from a steady 50 miles an hour and began to climb toward 60. The main road was empty of travelers as we approached Aten's gate. Unsurprisingly, given what we had learned from our journey through this kingdom. As Serlo had mentioned back in Keld, people probably only left their homes out of extreme necessity or desperation, and no one would be stupid enough to travel at night. Well, except for us. And we were different. We were armed to the teeth with metal and magic, and eager to shed a little bandit blood. We reduced our speed when we came within 50 yards of the main gate. From this distance, even in the weak light as the sun slipped completely below the horizon, I could tell the gate was shut and most likely barred tight. As the roar of Bobby's engine quieted to a purr, I heard the distant shouts of the guards atop the wall. My eyes tracked their movements as they ran with torches back and forth across the parapets, and I began to worry that they might shoot first and ask questions later. I squeezed Aurora's hip again and gently began to apply the brake. "I think we should walk the rest of the way," I said as we began to coast to a stop. "Those guards look a little skittish, and the bike is a little loud and scary, especially approaching in the dark. I would very much like not to be shot full of arrows."
Good plan,
Aurora remarked as we came to a full stop 25 yards away from the wall. Then she removed her hand from the ignition and killed the engine. In the ensuing silence, I could hear the guards' voices more clearly, and there was a definite note of panic to their shouts and orders. I winced and turned my head to address Kayla. "Is there anything we can do to ensure they won't shoot us?" I asked the princess.
if we approach calmly with our hands up, we should be fine.
Kayla replied with a slight frown. "Should be?" I asked with a raised eyebrow. Kayla's frown deepened and her brow furrowed.
I told you, I do not know how much has changed since I've been gone. The closed gate alone is strange to me, but I know most of the men in my father's retinue, and I know they would not, intentionally, shoot unarmed individuals, especially if 2 of them were women.
"Okay," I said with a sigh. "But that doesn't mean I'm letting the 2 of you walk out in front of me. I'll go first, and if I don't get shot at, the 2 of you can join me." Kayla pinned me with a deadpan stare, and then she slid off the back of the bike and marched toward the gate without another word. "Kayla!" I called out in alarm, and then Aurora and I scrambled to follow her. I barely had time to put Bobby's kickstand down before I broke out into a jog to catch up with the stubborn princess.
Do not shoot!
The raven-haired maiden called as she approached the gate with her hands held above her shoulders.
We are unarmed!
I cringed as I remembered the revolver strapped to my waist, but it was too late to turn back now. Besides, the guards probably wouldn't recognize it for the weapon it was. State your name and business, a guard shouted down from atop the wall. The city of Aiton is under curfew. Kayla came to a stop directly in front of the gate, and Aurora and I slowly slid up behind her with our arms held high too. The sun had completely slipped below the horizon now, and night quickly set in. I couldn't even see where the guard was calling from or what he looked like. The only light came from the torches 40 feet above our heads, and their weak halo barely reached us on the ground.
Where is Captain Mayard?
Kayla called.
I have need to speak with him.
And who are you to make such a request? The guard sneered back. Kayla turned and looked at Aurora over her shoulder.
Could I have a little light?
I saw the half-elf nod in my peripherals, and then a great fire leapt to life in her hand. The guards gasped along the wall, but Aurora merely held the flame above our heads as Kayla lifted her chin and fixed a steely-eyed stare on every man that stood above us.
I am Princess Kayla Barmier, daughter of your sovereign, King David, Lord of Cedis.
The raven-haired beauty declared in a loud and booming voice.
And I would like to enter my city and speak with my captain of the guard sometime tonight.
A shiver raced down my spine at the authoritative steel in her tone. I had to admit, it was incredibly hot. The guard who had previously spoken now sputtered, and then I saw a shadow lean over the parapet as he tried to get a better look at us. The princess is on a retreat with Queen Freya, the guard then called down, but his tone was now dubious and doubtful.
Are you willing to stake your life on that?
Kayla shot back as she put her hands on her hips.
Or will you open the gate and fetch Captain Mayard like I requested so he can vouch for me?
The guard didn't respond for a moment, and in the following silence the only noise was the wind as it whipped across the plains in my pounding heart. Finally the guard cleared his throat. "Raise the gate!" he shouted, and several men echoed his call before a great grinding filled the air as the wooden door before us began to lift. I let out a sigh of relief and lowered my arms. The three of us stood in the circle of Aurora's flame as the gate steadily lifted higher and higher. Then a squadron of men issued forth from the shadows beneath the gate, and the fire and moonlight glinted off unsheathed swords and burnished armor. I lifted my chin and straightened my spine as half a dozen men fanned out in a semicircle before us. Several of them carried torches, while the others held weapons, but there was a man in the center that held neither. He had a shock of wild red hair pulled back into a high ponytail, and he wore a full suit of shining silver armor. His face was stern and pinched, and he marched forward with one hand wrapped around the hilt of the sword at his hip. The man came to a stop 10 feet in front of us. His shrewd and dark eyes scanned over me, then Aurora, before they finally settled on Kayla. A tense moment passed, and then the man let out a loud snort. "I shouldn't be so surprised any more by your antics," he grumbled. I glanced at Kayla and saw her face break out in a wide smile.
Come now, Norik.
The princess laughed as she took a step forward.
Is that any way to say you missed me?
"Missed you like a thorn in my side, your highness." The soldier grunted, but his mouth twitched with the beginnings of a smile. "Though I am glad to see you returned in one stubborn piece." The princess tipped her head back and laughed, and the other soldiers slowly sheathed their weapons one by one. The tension in the air evaporated like mist, and suddenly the dark shadows seemed cozy instead of imposing.
As you have so delicately put it, I am too stubborn to return in anything less.
Kayla replied with a grin. The red-headed man shook his head, but then his discerning eyes clicked back over to me. He ran his gaze from my head to my feet, and he latched on to the revolver at my hip. I realized right then and there that this man was smart as a whip and was not to be fucked with. "Who are your friends, princess?" he asked as he met my eyes dead on.
These are allies I acquired in Alaria.
Kayla responded as she stepped between the soldiers and me. Then she gestured at Aurora first, perhaps to break the staring contest the redhead and I were locked into.
This is Defender Aurora Solana, Ignis Mage of the Order of Elementa.
A murmur passed through the soldiers, and I saw them cast each other worried glances. I realized we might be the first mages these men had ever encountered. The redhead didn't miss a beat, though. "It is an honor to make your acquaintance, Defender Solana," the man murmured as he politely dipped his head. When he lifted his chin, however, his eyes came straight back to me. Kayla noticed, and she reached out to place a hand on my shoulder in a supportive, friendly gesture.
This is Defender Mason Flint,
she said as she squeezed my arm. Then she turned and looked at me.
Mason, this is Captain Lorik Mayard, the commander of my father's royal retinue.
I met Mayard's eyes and lifted my chin as I extended my hand. "Nice to meet you." "The pleasure is mine, Defender Flint," he replied smoothly as he took my hand, but I could tell by the glint in his eye that he didn't quite trust me. To his credit, though, I was a complete stranger, and I did just ride out of the dark like something from a nightmare, astride a monstrous contraption, and I had the Princess of Cetus in tow. I'd be wary of me, too.
We need to speak to my father, Captain.
Kayla cut in as Mayard and I dropped hands.
We have news and information regarding the attacks. I think I have found a way to save our kingdom.
Mayard glanced back at the princess and dipped his chin in a nod. "And your father's sleepless nights will not have been in vain. Come, we should just be sitting down to dinner now." Almost on cue, my stomach grumbled loudly, and then Aurora's gurgled in reply. Mayard raised an eyebrow at me, and I grinned sheepishly. "It was a long day's ride," I explained with a shrug. "We probably should have packed more provisions when we left Ilaria, but I didn't think the journey would take so long." "How long did it take you?" the captain asked as he tilted his head. 3 days, I sighed, though we did get sidetracked along the way. Mayard's eyes went wide, and behind him the other soldiers gaped at me. "Did you say 3 days?" the redhead echoed incredulously. "That's impossible. A journey from here to Seren should take much longer." "Not the way I travel," I replied with a smirk, and then I jerked a thumb over my shoulder. The captain's eyes jumped over to Bobby's silhouette, parked in the shadows. "What is that?" "My mechanical steed," I responded as I slipped my hands casually into my pockets. Your men probably heard her as we approached. "That's what that noise was!" one of the soldiers chimed in, and I turned to see a young man in his 20s with his jaw practically on the ground. "We thought it was some kind of beast." Mayard shot the youth a glare for his outburst, and the soldier dropped his head. "She definitely has the spirit of one," I chuckled, "but she doesn't bite." "Can you leave her out here?" Mayard asked as he warily eyed the bike. "I'd prefer not to, given the bandit situation," I said with a wince. "But if you're worried about the noise drawing attention, I'd be willing to leave her parked in a stable or something within the city walls." The captain pursed his lips but nodded. "There is a stable just inside. Bring your steed, and then we will go see the king." "Sounds like a plan," I replied with a nod, and then I nudged Aurora's arm so she would follow me back to Bobby. Kayla stayed with her father's men, but it was a quick affair to start up the bike again and roll her through the city's gates. The soldiers jumped back out of our way and gaped blatantly as I casually walked Bobby forward. Even Mayard stared at us with wide eyes and a stiff spine, but Kayla walked calmly beside us with a grin on her face. Just as Mayard had said, right as we entered the city proper, the smell of manure tickled my nose, and I turned to the left to see a stable of horses. The street was cobblestone beneath Bobby's metal-studded wheels, and I sent out a burst of magic to act as a shield between the two. Even though I was pretty drained already, I didn't want the first thing I did in Aten to be tearing up the roads. I coasted Bobby to the outer wall of the stable, and then I squeezed Aurora's hip for her to kill the engine. Once the bike had rumbled into silence, the two of us hopped up. A thought suddenly occurred to me. "Give me just a second," I said to the half-elf as she removed her sword from the bike's frame and moved to join the others that stood 10 feet away. Then I turned back to Bobby and stooped to open one of her saddlebags. Stan lifted his tiny silver head to look up at me, and I couldn't help but smile. I was starting to like the little guy. "Come on," I whispered to him as I held out my hand. "We're off to see the king." Stan looked at me blankly but didn't move, so I sent out a little blast of magic while I envisioned him hopping into my palm. A moment later, Stan clambered to follow my instructions, and once he climbed into my hand, I quickly tucked him into my pocket. I also made a mental note to test my newfound power as soon as we got settled tonight. I needed to figure out how to control my creations as soon as possible if I was going to use them against Camus Dread and the mysterious Master. Once Stan was safely stowed away in my pocket, I stood up straight and loomed over Bobby as I summoned up one last tendril of magic. The ground beneath her tires vibrated for a moment before the cobblestones broke apart and then began to climb upward. A minute later, a coffin of stone had encased the whole bike.
A little overprotective, are we?
Aurora asked as she cocked an eyebrow. "Can't be too careful," I replied with a shrug. Then I reached out and patted the stone egg with a warm smile. "Thank you, girl. You did a fine job getting us here. I'll be back soon to clean you up, and then we'll talk about some upgrades."
Are you ready to go, or should I leave the two of you alone?
Aurora quipped as she placed a hand on her hip. "I'm ready," I chuckled, and then I jerked my head toward Kayla and the waiting soldiers. "Do you think one of them peed their pants when we started her up again?" The half-elf rolled her eyes, but the edge of her lips twitched upward in a smirk.
I do not think their reactions were that extreme, but I did catch a whiff of paralyzing fear.
Aurora wrinkled her nose at me, and I snorted to suppress my laughter. "King David awaits us, Defenders Solana and Flint," Maynard intoned as we joined him. "I have sent a messenger ahead of us, so both the king and some food will be prepared for your arrival." "Then lead the way," I said with a nod. Maynard nodded back, and then he spun on his heel and began to march deeper into the city. Aurora and I caught up to Kayla as his soldiers fell in step around us. "Welcome home, princess," I whispered to the long-legged maiden beside me. Kayla glanced at me out of the corner of her eye and flashed a weak smile.
Thank you, Mason. I do not deny I am relieved to be behind my city's walls again, but my only regret is that you do not meet her in a better light.
"The sun will rise tomorrow," I teased as I bumped her elbow. "Don't worry, I'll catch Aiden at sunrise one of these days."
That's not what I meant,
the princess muttered, and then her eyes darted down the road we walked down. The decidedly dead and empty road. The cobblestone street was lined by tall houses, all of them made of both stone and dark wood. The structures were 3, sometimes 4 stories tall, and they seemed to loom over the street as they cast their long, black shadows. Several small fires illuminated the path in front of us, some in the form of torches mounted to house walls, and others in the form of stone basins set at the intersections, the bowls stacked with kindling and set to flame. But the road was deserted, completely devoid of life. I glanced at the windows we passed, but all the curtains were drawn and dark. I frowned and faced forward again. "How long has the curfew been in effect?" I called out to Maynard a few feet in front of us. I spoke at a normal volume, but my voice echoed and ricocheted down the street. The red-headed captain glanced over his shoulder but did not pause his stride. 1 week. That is also when we shut the gate. Now people must state their intent and purpose before they are granted entrance to the city." "If you shut the gates, then why still enact the curfew?" I asked as my brow furrowed. "Because we still do not know if some of Dread's men are hiding within our walls," Maynard grunted as he turned back around and quickened his pace. "For the people's own good, they must stay in their homes once the sun sets. I do not have enough men to protect all of them." "I understand," I said solemnly, but I couldn't help glancing at the windows again. I did understand completely where Maynard was coming from, but I could only imagine how hard it must be for the people of Ayton to not feel safe in their own city, maybe not even in their own homes. I looked over at Kayla and saw that she had her bottom lip trapped between her teeth, and she was biting down so hard I was afraid she would draw blood. Not caring about the soldiers around us, I reached out, slid my hand into hers, and squeezed. "Everything will be okay," I said softly when the princess glanced at me. "We're here now, and after a night's rest, we're going to brainstorm the best ways to start kicking ass. Kayla released her lower lip, the skin a bright red, and smiled weakly.
I know, and I am eager to begin that portion of our plan, but I just cannot help but feel that I abandoned my people.
The princess looked out over the deserted street again, and even in the weak torchlight, I could see the tears glistening on her eyelashes. I opened my mouth to respond, but Aurora actually beat me to it.
You did the best thing you could do,
The half-elf said gently, and then she took Kayla's other hand and flashed the princess a fierce grin.
You came and found us, and now Mason and I will not rest until your kingdom is safe. You have my word.
The frown began to fade from Kayla's face, so I sidestepped and knocked my hip against hers. Besides, I added with a cocky smile, once your people see what I can do firsthand, they'll be throwing flowers at your feet. Aurora snorted, but a giggle slipped from Kayla's lips, and it was like music to my ears.
Well, I do like flowers.
The princess laughed, and then she squeezed my hand back as she looked deep into my eyes.
Thank you, Mason.
I am at your service, my lady, I declared with an overdramatic bow. Kayla's smile widened, but then Maynard cleared his throat in front of us. Ahem. We are almost to the castle gate, the captain announced, and when he glanced at me over his shoulder, his gaze was narrowed and suspicious. I made a mental note to tone down the flirting with Kayla, at least in the presence of higher-up officials, especially her father. Thank you, Captain, I replied with a nod, and when I looked over at the women beside me, I saw both of them try to duck their heads and hide their smiles. We passed the rest of the walk in relative silence, and I took the opportunity to study Aiden a little more closely. Since the town itself was built on a knoll, the entire journey from gate to castle had been uphill. I hadn't noticed it much, as it was mostly a gentle incline, but as we neared the apex, my calves began to burn. The castle loomed before us, an imposing shadow cut out against the darker night sky. A spire rose from its center and pierced the heavens, and the rest of the castle's architecture seemed similarly angular and sharp. The castle in Seren, home of King Temmin, was rounder and more irregularly shaped since it was cut into the mountain. Aiton's castle looked like it would cut me if I touched it. When the castle gate rose up in front of us, and Maynard quickened his stride to call up to his men, I chanced a glance over my shoulder, and the air left my lungs in a great whoosh. Aiton spread out below me, and from this angle I couldn't tell that anything was wrong. I couldn't pick out the barren streets or the loose cobblestones I had spotted, or the rotting corners of wooden houses. From this height, the city was beautiful and charming under the light of the moon, and the small torchlights looked like fireflies dancing through the darkness.
Mason, come on.
Aurora muttered as she tugged at my elbow. I turned back around to find that the Ignis Mage and I were alone. Kayla and the other soldiers had already reached the castle gates. Sorry, I replied with a quick smile. Just taking it all in.
We will have time for that later,
the half-elf said as she pulled at my arm again.
Everyone is waiting on us now.
Yes, dear, I teased, but I followed the blue-haired maiden to the castle all the same. Once we were inside the castle proper, several more guards joined our parade. They fell easily into line behind us, and I could feel their eyes glued to the back of my neck, especially when Kayla slowed down to join Aurora and me again.
We are meeting my father in his private banquet hall,
the princess relayed to us, and I would have thought she would be excited at the prospect, but her face had creased in a frown once more. Is that a bad thing? I asked as I tilted my head.
It is when I am wearing this,
Kayla grumbled as she reached down and tugged at the fabric of her incredibly tight outfit.
Father told me to wear something no one would recognize me in. He didn't exactly see what I chose before I departed.
I winced and took a half-step away from the princess to put some proper distance between us. I'll keep my hands to myself and my eyes above chin level. I don't want your dad to get the wrong idea.
The wrong idea?
Kayla echoed as she raised an eyebrow, and then her gaze slid over to me slowly and sensually. Or the right one? I corrected with another cringe. I'd offer you my shirt, but I think we'd only run into a similar problem.
Thank you for the offer.
Kayla replied with a sigh, but then she lifted her chin and squared her shoulders.
Well, there's nothing to be done now. My father needs the information we have, so he will simply have to deal with a little impropriety.
She nodded with finality, but when we arrived at a set of great mahogany doors, some of that bravado melted off her shoulders. I wanted to reach out and squeeze her hand again, but Mayer didn't give me the chance, as he waved to a pair of guards on either side of the doors, and the pair of them jumped to open the way for us. We entered a vast room that had to be nearly 30 yards long. Along the far left wall roared a great fire, and the flames cast their orange light and warmth across the rest of the room. Bright tapestries of multiple colors hung on the walls, and there were some end tables pushed into the corners, but there was no other furniture in the hall save a long table that sat in the center and ran the length of the room. My eyes traveled down the dark wooden table until they snagged on a man who sat in the farthest chair to the right, at the head of the table. The man stood as we entered, green robes flashing around him, and I got my first look at the King of Cetus. I could immediately tell where Kayla got her height and long legs from. King David was a tall man, probably a few inches taller than me, but that was where the similarities between him and his daughter ended. The king had long blonde hair plaited in a braid down the middle of his back. I could see it swing as he walked toward us, and when he finally came to a stop several feet away, I saw that his eyes were a light brown, like the color of fine aged whiskey. Those whiskey eyes went first to his daughter, and I felt Kayla tense beside me. But the king's face betrayed nothing as his gaze skipped next to Aurora and then finally settled on me. I am King David Volmier, sovereign of Cetus, Kayla's father announced, and his voice dripped with authority. Welcome to my kingdom. Thank you, your majesty, I replied as I dipped my head in a low bow. It is our pleasure to be here. I am Defender Mason Flint. Then I turned and gestured to the half-elf beside me. This is my companion defender Aurora Solana. We are mages with Ilaria's Order of Elementa. King David raised an eyebrow, but the rest of his face stayed impassive. My daughter traveled to Ilaria to ask Temen for aid, and he sends only 2 mages in response. Although Kayla's father kept his voice even, I could see a vein throb at his temple, and the great dark circles lined the bottom of his eyes. Not to sound overly proud, your majesty, I said cautiously, but Defender Solana and I will be more than enough to help you purge your kingdom of darkness. Oh, really? David asked flatly as he dragged his eyes from my shoes to my face. I opened my mouth to respond, but my stomach cut me off with a loud gurgle. The king's eyes dropped to my stomach, and his lips pursed into a thin line. Forgive me, he said. I am not being a good host. Come, let us eat, and then we may discuss these issues further. David clapped his hands, and a door on the other side of the fire swung open. A moment later, servants spilled forth, their hands laden with plates of food and flagons of wine and ale. Thank you, sire, I said as I dipped my head again. The king nodded in return and then turned to Kayla with the barest hints of a frown. Do you wish to change for dinner, daughter? Kayla lifted her chin and met his gaze unflinchingly.
I must wash the dirt from the road off me first. I will wait until after dinner because we have had a long and perilous journey, and I am hungry.
Very well, David replied, but his frown deepened a fraction of a degree. Then he turned back to Aurora and me and waved his hand at the table. Come, sit. You are wearied from your travels. He strode back to the head of the table and flared his green robe out behind him as he sat. The soldiers we had entered with, even Captain Maynard, faded to the outskirts of the room simultaneously. Aurora and I shared a look, but Kayla marched up to the table and took the seat to his right, so I had no choice but to take the chair to his left, and Aurora sat down on my other side. Once we were seated, the servants swarmed around us as they placed dish after dish on the table. There was roasted duck and several species of fish that I guessed came from the lake outside the city. There was a small braised lamb, still on the bone, and stuffed pheasant that swam in gravy. There were baskets of warm bread and delicate plates of pastries that glistened with sugars and jams. There weren't as many crops on the table as I would have expected, though. Some leafy greens, buttered potatoes and carrots, a plate of sautéed mushrooms, but that was about it. I wondered if that was an effect of Camus dread. It couldn't be easy to transport crops through bandit country. When all the food had been set on the table and the servants had retreated back to the kitchens, I waited with my hands in my lap, unsure of how proper etiquette worked when one was dining with a king. I had eaten with King Temin before, but Ilaria's ruler was much laxer, it seemed, than Cetus's was. Though to be fair, I hadn't shown up after dark with Temin's daughter. There was a tense and silent pause that seemed to grow heavier with every second, but then David reached out and plucked a roll of bread from a basket before he turned next to the roasted duck. Across from me, Kayla let out a barely audible sigh, and then she met my eyes and nodded as she reached for the braised lamb. My stomach growled ferociously, and I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my own roll of bread before I pulled the plate of potatoes to me, and then I went for a stuffed pheasant. It was quiet as we all started to tuck into our meals. The only noise in the room was the clink of silverware and the crunch of bone and sinew. Spices and grease exploded on my tongue, and as good as the sod poodle had been, I had to stop my eyes from rolling into the back of my head. "So," King David said into the silent room, once I had devoured my pheasant and was reaching for a plate of blackened fish. "Tell me, how did you come to meet my daughter, and how do you plan on helping me save my kingdom?" I looked up and swallowed a gulp of wine. The king gazed at me expectantly, with his fingers interlaced and folded beneath his chin. "Well," I coughed as I cleared my throat. "I think I have to speak first of Ilaria before I answer your questions. Our story needs a little context." "Proceed, then," David replied with a casual wave of his hand. I cleared my throat again and took another sip of wine as I gathered my thoughts. "It's difficult to find one place to begin," I started. "But the general summary is that Ilaria has suffered the same troubles that have plagued your kingdom, at least the ones that occurred before the bandits showed up." At the mention of bandits, David's eyes blazed with fury, but he quickly schooled his face back into a neutral expression. "So, there have been attacks in Ilaria as well, then, you are saying?" the king mused. I nodded. "Yes, we had more than several beasts wreak havoc across the kingdom, just like the Chimera did here. However, we haven't had any attacks perpetrated by people, though it might only be a matter of time before those happen in Ilaria too. Defender Solana and I did slay a drake, a hydra, and a basilisk, though, and that was only in the last 2 weeks or so." "You slew all 3 of those beasts on your own?" David asked, as he studied me with his whiskey-colored eyes. "That is an impressive feat." "I have a well-stocked arsenal at my fingertips," I replied with a smile, and then I showed him the mage's mark on the back of my hand. "Yes, I have heard of the prowess of mages," the king murmured as his eyes traced the lines across my knuckles. "I am sure you have, your majesty," I said as my grin grew. "But I have something a little extra. You see, Defender Solana is an Ignis mage. That means she can control fire. I, on the other hand, am a Terra mage, which means I can manipulate earth. But I also have a few other gods-gifted abilities." "Like what?" David questioned as his brow furrowed. "Like this," I responded, and then I reached out and plucked a silver fork from the table beside me. I sent out a small wave of magic, and the metal utensil began to bubble and melt in my hand. When the material had become soft enough, I let out another burst of power and reshaped the metal into a small silver crown. I leaned forward and set the crown beside the king's hand. David looked down at it with wide eyes, the first real emotion I had seen on his face. When the king only continued to stare, I decided to press on. "I have the ability to manipulate metal," I explained, "as I have just demonstrated. I use this power to craft new weapons for King Temen's men, weapons strong enough to defeat bloodthirsty beasts and men alike."
That's how I found him, Father.
Kayla cut in.
I went to Temen first to ask for his aid, but he said his men and kingdom were overtaxed and could not help. I had heard a tale of a mage who had slew 2 great beasts, and I went searching for him.
The princess's ice-blue eyes cut to me, and a small smile tugged at her mouth.
He agreed to help me.
She continued.
And after we dealt with the problem in Ilaria, we hastened to return here to do the same in Cetus.
"Dealt with the problem?" the king echoed as he frowned. "What do you mean?" To my left I felt Aurora go rigid, and I slid my hand under the table to squeeze her knee before I explained. "There was a man in Ilaria," I began. "Abris Zorik. He was the leader of the Order of Elementa. However, as I was finishing the weapons King Temen had commissioned, Abris revealed himself to be a traitor. He was the one that executed the attacks in Ilaria. He controlled the beasts by carving runes into their hides, runes from an ancient elvish dialect, runes of power and magic." "What did they look like?" Davit asked, his eyes intense. Before I could respond, Kayla cut in again.
"They are the same as the ones we found on the farmer,"
the princess replied.
"I saw it with my own eyes."
"And this mage," the king went on, as his eyes darted back to me. "What has become of him?" Aurora was so still at my side, I was worried that she wasn't even breathing. "He's dead," I said as delicately as I could. "He attacked the king and us, and I did what I had to in order to survive." Davit's eyes studied me again, this time a little closer, and I thought I could see a gleam of admiration in their depths. "So, what you are saying is that the attacks should be over now?" the king declared, and relief started to creep across the edges of his face. "Not exactly," I replied with a wince. Before Abris died, he alluded to an accomplice, someone that he referred to as Master. However, we don't know this man's identity, and we worry that with Abris dead, this Master might turn his attention back to Cetus. However, the time frame of that is speculative at best. This Master could attack tomorrow in retaliation, or he could bide his time as he regroups and reorganizes in the wake of Abris's death. There's no way to be certain. "But what could this Master's motivation possibly be?" Davit demanded as he scowled. "My kingdom is neither large nor great. We have no mages, no standing army. We have nothing to offer." "That is what we are here to try and find out," I responded as I lifted my chin against the king's onslaught of frustration and anger. "We aim to find the identity of this Master, figure out what he is planning, and stop him. Aurora and I will not rest until Cetus is as protected as Ilaria." King Davit sighed and sat back heavily in his chair. "And here I thought Camus Dread was the worst of my worries," he muttered as he rubbed tiredly at his brow. "He became bold once the attacks had started, but those were far and few in between at first. But Dread saw a moment of weakness, and he seized upon it. Now my country is overrun with bandits. My people suffer, and I have not the power or means to stop it." "Oh, don't worry," I growled as I clenched my hand around my fork. "I plan to take care of Camus Dread, too. I owe him for the journey to Aten." "What happened?" the king asked as he sat up again and looked to his daughter. "Are you all right?"
"I am fine, Father,"
Kayla replied with a soft smile.
"We ran into some bandits along the border, and then again in the town of Keld, but Mason quickly took care of them. He also disarmed and fixed every booby trap along the back roads as we traveled across the country today."
"Today?" Davit echoed as his brow furrowed. You traveled from Kel to here in one day? Tomorrow I'll introduce you to my mechanical steed, I told the king with a grin. She's quite a beauty. I'll also show you some of my other creations, and then we can get started on figuring out the best way to take down Camus Dread and all the evil bastards that are hiding in your kingdom, if you'll pardon my language, your majesty. By other creations you mean weapons, correct? The king questioned as he reached out and picked up his goblet of wine. Partially, I replied as my smile grew. I also have a few other things up my sleeves. Or my pockets, coincidentally. King David frowned at me, but I held up a finger and reached down under the table with my other hand. Cool metal brushed my palm, and I delicately cupped my fingers as I withdrew my hand from my pocket and then set it flat on the tabletop. Sire, I'd like you to meet a friend of mine, I said as I uncurled my fingers. This is Stan, another product of my gods-given powers. The little stick figure stretched as he stood up, and then he turned his ball-bearing head to look from me to the king, as if to ask what he should do. The king gaped down at the stick man, and the goblet of wine slipped from his fingers to crash against the tabletop. A tidal wave of red spilled across the table and swept Stan off his feet. He slid a few inches before he came to a stop beside the plate of lamb. Then he reached out with his little matchstick arm, pulled himself back to his feet, and shook the droplets of wine from his head. He's only a prototype, I added as I leaned forward and plucked him from the table. A test, if you will. But I think that with some study and experimentation, I will definitely be able to help rid you of your bandit problem. I wiped the wine off Stan with my cloth napkin, and then I held my fingertip above his head. This time, I didn't have to send out a tendril of magic for him to give me a high five. It seemed he could learn things somehow. A grin stretched across my face, and I lifted my head to look at the king once again. David was pale as the unstained parts of the tablecloth before us, and his wide eyes were trained on Stan unblinkingly. When the silence had stretched too long, Kayla leaned over and set her hand atop his.
You asked for aid, and I brought you a miracle,
the princess said with a smug smile.
You are welcome, father.
Then she sat back and primly returned to her dinner, and I had to suppress a laugh. Chapter 6. A day and a half after our dinner with King David, I found myself in a familiar position, hunched over a table, surrounded by dozens of little metal pieces, my hands sore from use, and my eyes strained to the point of tears. "Come on," I grumbled to the metal in my hands as I used my shoulder to wipe the sweat off my brow. "Work with me here." I took a deep breath, slowly bent my hands together, and waited for the click. Nothing happened. "Son of a bitch!" I groaned as I all but threw the unfinished gun onto the tabletop. I sighed and pressed my palms into my eye sockets. I didn't even care that I was smearing dirt and sweat all over my face. At this point, I was basically made up of grime, sweat, and soot. I was in real need of a bath, but I could barely pull myself away from the work table long enough to catch a few hours of sleep. Every moment that I didn't spend in the castle's workshop made me feel antsy because I knew that Camus Dread was out there, robbing and pillaging as he went. There was also the mysterious master to consider. He was like a dark cloud in the back of my mind. He loomed over me day and night, and I felt as if he was steadily drawing closer. I was constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, so showering felt frivolous, sleep was an annoyance, and thoughts of food barely registered in my churning brain as I buckled down and tried to finalize my new weapon. The top-break revolver wasn't coming together as easily as I had first assumed it would, though. I had all of Elias's schematics and diagrams, and after I had spent days making 50 guns off those illustrations, production and assembly had basically become muscle memory. I knew exactly how many screws I needed, how much space to leave each moving part, and how everything was supposed to line up and fit together. I even spent most of my first day in Ayton making a small batch of the fixed-frame revolvers for King David's royal guards, so that I could remember the feel of putting them together. So as the sun sank into the low afternoon on my first full day in the capital, I had thought all this knowledge would translate seamlessly as I shifted to this more efficient design. I was wrong. The foundations were basically the same: the grips, the trigger, the hammer and cylinder, etc. It was still a revolver after all. However, the element that made the top break a more efficient gun to load and shoot also made it incredibly more difficult to construct. My first few attempts were pretty much total failures, as I tried to figure out where the extra springs needed to go that would allow the gun to open like I wanted. It was a morning of trial and error, but I eventually managed a full piece that looked very much like what I remembered a top-break revolver should look like. This pilot prototype, however, broke completely in half in my hands when I tried to open it like it was a twig I had snapped over my knee. I quickly realized that the hinge wasn't strong enough, so I melted down the metal and tried again. My second try was definitely stronger, but it ended up being too unyielding. I couldn't get the hinge all the way open, and half of the cylinder was blocked by the rest of the gun's frame. So I went back to work, molding metals together to try to get an alloy that could support the joint, rotate, and also be strong enough to handle the pressure of the powder. Last night, before Aurora and Kayla came to drag me to bed, I finally had a prototype that I thought was ready for testing. I set up a small firing range in the castle's courtyard, and, by the light of the moon above me and Aurora's flames scattered in torches around me, I put my finger on the trigger and squeezed. The revolver had all but exploded in my hand. My magic saved me from any serious injuries, but my ego was bruised enough for me to turn in for the night. This morning, rested and refreshed, I came back to the workshop and picked apart the carcass of my failed prototype. After hours of close study, I came to the conclusion that I hadn't made the frame sturdy enough, so when I fired the gun, the escaping high pressure was still too much for the frame's structure to handle. Additionally, the latch on top of the barrel was mangled almost beyond recognition, so I also concluded that the latch itself had been faulty, which is why it had come apart so violently. So I made meticulous notes of all these observations, sketched out a few new diagrams, and then I got back to work. Now here I was, late into the afternoon, with an almost completed gun on the table before me. The finish line was in sight, but I just kept goddamn fumbling. I sighed as I leaned back on my stool and stared up at the ceiling without seeing. The Royal Blacksmith's workshop here in Aden was a lot smaller and a lot less fancy than Ogder's shop back in Seren, but they basically looked the same. It was a large, hot, cluttered room with forges along the back wall and tables on every empty piece of floor. There were no windows, however, and it made me miss my own workshop that was open to the breeze. Of course, it was now closed and sealed up in Ilaria's mountain range, but that was beside the point.
You look like you are working hard.
A dry voice came from the workshop's doorway.
Or is it hardly working?
I turned to find Aurora and Kayla framed in the threshold. The half-elf was the one who had spoken, and she stared at me with her arms crossed and a single eyebrow cocked expectantly. "I am taking a moment to gather my thoughts," I sniffed as I turned my nose up at them. "You can't rush art, Aurora."
Uh-huh.
The Ignis mage replied sarcastically, but I could see the edges of her mouth tremble as she fought back a smile.
You haven't hurt yourself again, have you, Mason?
Kayla asked with a frown as she took a step forward into the room. The movement caused the skirts of her long dress to swish around her ankles, and my eyes ran up and down the length of the princess as I took her in. Since we had been back in her kingdom, the raven-haired beauty had abandoned the sexy and revealing disguise I had first met her in, and switched it out for long, form-hugging dresses that I assumed were more suitable for the daughter of the king. I missed the chains and thigh-high boots, but I was quickly coming around to the dresses. The one Kayla wore right now was the same ice-blue color of her eyes, and it clung to her curves like a second skin as it flowed down to the floor. My fingers itched to hitch up her skirt and have my way with her right here in the Royal Blacksmith's workshop.
Mason?
Kayla asked again, and her voice snapped me out of my lustful fantasies. "What?" I blinked as I lifted my head, and when I met the princess's concerned gaze, I remembered her question. "Oh yeah, no, I'm fine. No injuries here." I lifted my hands and flashed my palms and my knuckles, both devoid of cuts or burns.
A trend not likely to continue if you keep ogling Princess Balmier.
Aurora teased as she sauntered across the room and perched herself on the table beside me. Kayla's cheeks flushed a sweet pink, but the smirk she threw me was anything but sweet.
Like what you see?
She asked as she ran her hand down her hips. You know I do, I grumbled as I shifted in my seat to adjust my pants. Which means you're just being cruel now.
It is only cruel if I do not intend to follow through,
the princess replied as she swung her hips and walked toward me.
And I very much intend to do just that.
She brushed her hands across the back of my neck as she went around and took the stool to my left, and when she sat down and met my eyes, she licked at her bottom lip. I groaned unintelligibly and reached out to grasp the tantalizing woman, but she playfully slapped at my hand.
However,
she said with a wide grin,
you must finish your work first. Then you can receive your reward.
Always a catch, I muttered as I dropped my hands back into my lap.
Such is life.
Aurora chuckled on my other side, and then she leaned over and nudged at my shoulder.
How's the new design coming?
Well, while you and Her Highness were off taking a lovely tour of the castle, I said as I narrowed my eyes accusatorially, I was here starting production from scratch.
You make it sound as if we spent the last 2 days trying on dresses instead of inspecting the castle's fortifications,
Aurora replied with a roll of her eyes. So you say, I mumbled, but then the Ignis mage cuffed me on the shoulder, and I held up my hands in surrender. All right, I'm sorry. I'm sure you were working hard. I'm a little tired and frustrated is all, forgive me.
What is the problem?
Kayla asked as she leaned forward in her stool and glanced at the table in front of me. I sighed and raked my fingers back through my hair. Take your pick. I've had a lot of them. The problem that caused last night's little spectacle was, I think, because the gun's frame wasn't as strong as it should have been. So today I started from zero again, and I made sure to make this piece as sturdy as possible given that there are so many moving parts. I trailed off and glared down at the revolver.
And?
Aurora prompted. And I don't know if I've succeeded on that front, because I can't get that damn thing to latch, I groused as I folded my arms over my chest. If I can't get it to close properly, I'm just going to have the same problem as I did last night, and I don't exactly want an encore, so I can't test it until I figure out this problem. But I'm probably going to have to take the whole thing apart again and see where I went wrong. The two women were silent for a moment as we all stared down at the gun. Well, they stared. I continued to glare. Just as I was about to resign myself completely to another disassembly, Kayla reached out and delicately touched the gun with the tip of her finger.
Could you not use your magic?
She questioned as she tilted her head and continued to consider the revolver. I frowned. I tried that the first time around before I went to the watchmaker in Seren. My magic wants to take shortcuts. It attempts to fill in the blanks of what I don't know with what should happen, or at least what I think should happen. Getting the mechanics to work is trial and error. Elias, the watchmaker, made it look easy, but he deals with tiny moving parts every day. I don't have the same knowledge that he does.
No.
Kayla replied with a soft smile.
But you have a connection and an advantage that he does not. You have your power.
I don't understand, I said with a furrowed brow. The princess pursed her lips and tapped at her chin with a slim finger.
All right. I do not fully comprehend how your abilities work, but I believe you have done similar things. How did you mine the ore for these weapons back in Ilaria? More specifically, how did you find them in the bedrock?
My magic, I started, and then my eyes widened as realization slowly washed over me. I sent out my magic, like a pulse, and with it I could tell where things were.
Yes,
Kayla replied as a wide smile broke out over her face.
And then, when the basilisk attacked, you did the same thing when you used your power to find the gun in the workshop. And then you used that same magic to summon the weapon to you when you fought Abris.
So maybe, I said as I sat up straight and my heart began to pound with excitement. Maybe I can do the same thing but on a much smaller scale. I send my magic out like a radar, pinpoint the problem, and then fix it from inside the gun. No disassembly required.
Sounds like you have a plan now.
Aurora chipped in as she crossed and then recrossed her legs on the table in front of me. I put a hand to my forehead and blinked owlishly at Kayla. Gods! How did I not think of this sooner? The princess giggled and leaned forward to peck a kiss against my cheek.
Sometimes you just need a little perspective,
Kayla responded as she pulled back.
You are also a little prone to tunnel vision, Mason. You like to face a problem head-on, and you keep advancing until it gives way to you.
Are you calling me stubborn? I asked as I narrowed my eyes in mock offense.
Strong-willed,
Kayla corrected with a smile.
And it is not a poor attribute to have. Lesser men would have abandoned a project like these weapons long ago, but not you, Mason. And not only have you created successful versions, but now you are making improvements. What you have accomplished is no small feat.
My cheeks warmed at the compliments, and I reached out to squeeze her hand. Thanks, Kayla. The blue-eyed princess squeezed back and grinned.
Before we inflate Mason's ego any further,
Aurora cut in as she slid off the tabletop.
Could we perhaps try this solution you've proposed? Dinner is approaching, and I'm rather hungry after pacing the castle's parapets.
Patience is a virtue, Defender Solana, I teased as I turned to look up at the standing half-elf. The Ignis mage simply planted her hands on her hips and raised her eyebrows at me expectantly. All right, I chuckled, and then I reached out to pick up the revolver. Let me give it a try. I wrapped my fingers around the cool metal and cupped the gun in both of my palms. Then I flashed a quick smile at the women beside me before I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and summoned up my magic. It was a little overwhelming at first. When I did this during mining, I instructed my power to seek out metal in the rock, and since the two were so different, it was easy to hone in on the ore and pull it out. This was different. The entire revolver was made of metal, and more than that, it was metal that my magic had already touched. Vague impressions rebounded back to me, impressions of what the metal used to be, and then what I had molded it into, and they all overlapped to form a kind of white noise or static. I furrowed my brow and concentrated harder as I tried to wade past all the non-essential information my magic was delivering to me. I focused instead on the shape of the revolver, the shape of its frame and springs and joints. Then I centered in on the way these pieces came together, how the edges butted up against one another, and how they shifted and reshaped themselves as each one moved independently. I bent the frame in my hand back and forth along the pivot hinge, and I saw in my mind's eye how the pieces glided and slid and— There! I exclaimed out loud as my eyes flew open. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Kayla jump and Aurora twitch.
What? Did you find the problem?
Kayla asked excitedly as she leaned forward. Yes, I replied with a broad grin, and then I broke the barrel open entirely to point beneath the cylinder. Here, the frame is just slightly misaligned along this hinge. The swivel actually needs to be moved forward on the frame also. That will keep the heavier part of the body absorbing the impact. Kayla squinted her eyes as she leaned even closer, and even Aurora frowned at the gun.
I do not see the issue with the swivel,
the half-elf remarked, and my grin grew wolfish as I realized that not even her enhanced sight could spot the error. I didn't either, I replied, which is because it's barely a hair's breadth off. I don't think it's visible to the naked eye, but with my powers, I could see it like a fault line running across a map. That small space is what is keeping the barrel catch from latching properly, but you know what? It wouldn't even be an issue if it wasn't placed so close to the grip. That's actually the real issue.
Can you fix it?
Aurora asked as her emerald green eyes flickered up to mine. Let's find out, I said as adrenaline and magic snaked through my blood. I closed my eyes again and sent out a tendril of my power into the revolver. It wound through the creases and crevices before it found the misalignment. In my mind's eye, I watched as my magic flared white-hot within the skeleton of the gun, and then I felt that the metal shifted and adjusted as I willed it to. Then I placed a small block of raw steel on the side of the frame, and the entire lower joint moved forward so that the swivel was another half an inch forward on the body. When I opened my eyes again, the revolver looked whole and untouched, but I could still feel my power radiate off it. My magic seductively whispered to me about the perfection of the weapon I held, and my heart began to pound a steady but fast rhythm. "Moment of truth," I whispered, and then I grasped each end of the frame and bent my hands to bring them back together. The two metallic pieces met with a rasp, and then I pushed a little harder. A click resounded across the silent room as the barrel catch successfully latched and locked. "Oh, hell yeah," I breathed as I held the revolver up in front of my face. It felt way more secure. The dark metal of the barrel reflected the orange flame of the surrounding torches, and besides me, the two women beside me and Bobby 2.0, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The only thing it needed now was the grips, and I already had those cut and set aside. I turned back to the tabletop and searched through the chaos until I spotted a flash of white. When I reached out and picked up the grips, the pale material was cool and smooth against my fingers. "Remind me to thank your father for all these materials," I said with a nod at the work table. "The ore, tools, and use of the workshop too, of course, but I'm really grateful for these ivory grips."
Well, no one else was using the Chimera's teeth,
Kayla replied with a flash of her own.
My father was glad to donate them to a good cause.
"And there's no better cause than putting bandits in the dirt," I said with a broad grin. I finished affixing the grips in place with a few screws and several twists of magic, and then I lifted the revolver and sighted down the 7-inch barrel. I put a section of wall on the other side of the workshop in my sights, and then I placed my finger on the trigger and squeezed. The loud click of the empty chamber was like music to my ears.
Should we go test it now?
Aurora suggested, with bright eyes and an eager smile. Kayla's blue eyes and grin were equally wide as she nodded her head enthusiastically.
Yes, I believe it is still early in the evening. We could set up the firing range while there is still daylight left. If it works, we'll have a celebratory dinner, and then we can start production in full tomorrow.
Actually, I started with a wince as I set the revolver back on the table. "That's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." The princess blinked and then frowned.
What do you mean?
I sighed and rubbed at the beard on my cheeks. I mean, I've been giving it some thought these last few days, and I think that while guns might have been Ilaria's solution, I don't believe they are for Cetus. Both women stared at me in shock and confusion.
I do not understand,
Aurora said as her eyebrows furrowed into a sharp V above her bottle-glass green eyes.
Yes,
Kayla added, and the princess worried at her bottom lip.
you have all these weapon designs, and you just completed your first improved model. Why do all that work if you didn't believe it would help?
Well, I did at first, I explained, and I needed to make these upgrades for myself anyway. I can't go up against the likes of Camus Dread or this master without every advantage I can think of, and reloading faster is definitely an advantage. However, as I worked, I gave the problem and your kingdom some more thought. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that guns won't be as effective here as they were in Ilaria. Though I did go ahead and make a batch of 30 guns, both the fixed-frame, regular revolvers and the rifles, for the royal retinue that King David has here in the castle, just in case Camus Dread or the mysterious master had any ideas about attacking Aiden straight on. I turned and gestured to a large wooden box that was shoved up against the workshop's far wall. Inside were nestled 20 lever-action rifles and 10 revolvers. Unlike the top break, it had taken me less than my first day in Cetus to craft all of those, since I was well practiced in their designs. It was little more than muscle memory, and this time around I didn't even need Aurora or Kayla's help to put them all together.
Why do you not believe that more guns wouldn't be helpful?
Aurora asked as she tilted her head. Because as Kayla and her father both pointed out to us, I replied with a nod toward the princess. Cetus does not have a standing army like Ilaria does, so we have no one to arm with these weapons effectively and send them out to deal with bandits or monsters. At first, I had considered possibly making a whole lot of the guns and then figuring out a way to ship them to the town so they can defend themselves, but that opened up a whole other realm of problems, which is why I only ended up making a small batch for the Royal Guard.
Problems like what?
Kayla asked with a frown. The princess's eyes were sharp and cold as ice, and I could tell that I had upset her with my declaration. But I had given this a lot of thought and consideration, and I knew that I was right. Like the fact that most of the citizens of Cetus have not had weapons training, which increases the risk of accidental injury, I pointed out gently. Granted, the soldiers in Ilaria have never been trained with guns, but at least they have some foundational respect on how to handle dangerous and lethal objects. Kayla opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to cut her off. More than that, I went on. If we mass-produced these weapons and then shipped them off, we also run the incredible risk that they'll be intercepted or stolen, and they could fall into the wrong hands. The bandits are bad enough already. Now imagine how dangerous they could be if they were armed with our guns. Kayla's mouth fell shut, and she pursed her lips as she realized that my reasoning and logic was valid. I reached out and took the princess's hand into my own as I looked deep into her eyes. I promised to help you save your kingdom, and you know that I am a man of my word. I just do not believe this is the way to do it.
Then what do you propose?
Kayla questioned as her fingers clenched tight around my hand.
Do you plan on riding across the countryside, shooting as you go? That could take weeks, months even, and meanwhile my people will continue to suffer, and this master that we seek will continue to plot.
I know, I said gently, so that's why I have another plan, although your suggestion of bandit hunting does sound really appealing. I flashed a quick smile, and Kayla's lips twitched in return.
What is this other plan, Mason?
Aurora asked as she leaned her hip against the table's edge. I glanced up at the Ignis Mage from my seated position, and my smile stretched into a grin. Stan, I replied simply. The half-elf raised an eyebrow at me.
Stan. Your plan is to sick Stan on the bandits.
Well, not Stan specifically, I conceded, and then I frowned and glanced around the room. Where is that little guy anyway? He was waddling around the table a little while ago.
That was this morning, Mason.
Aurora responded with a chuckle and a shake of her head.
Before I told you I was taking him on our rounds.
Then she stood up a little straighter and reached into her pocket. When she withdrew her hand, Stan stretched in her palm. Hey, buddy. I greeted the stick man with a smile and a raised fingertip. He jumped a centimeter off Aurora's hand to give me a high five.
He had a grand time touring the castle with us,
the half-elf remarked as the stick figure toddled forward and fell into my own hand. I bet the company was more beautiful than the castle, I quipped as I looked back at the Ignis Mage with a wink. Aurora rolled her eyes, but her cheeks flushed a faint crimson.
How does Stan work into our bandit problem? She asked as she changed the subject.
Well, I'm not entirely sure yet, I admitted as I dropped my head to watch Stan waddle around my palm. But I know Nemris gave me these powers for a reason, so they must be part of the solution. I just have to figure out how.
Will you build more stands?
Kayla questioned as she reached out and rubbed the stick figure's head.
Larger and stronger ones, of course.
And with joints, I joked as Stan stiffly turned around and waddled toward my thumb. Actually... I trailed off as an idea struck me, and I turned back toward the chaotic and cluttered tabletop. My eyes scanned across the mess for a moment, and then I spotted a spare piece of steel that I had discarded to the very edge of the table. I reached out and picked up the small lump of metal. It was no bigger than a quarter, and it was cool to the touch as it rolled around my palm.
What are you doing?
Kayla asked as she leaned closer. Give me a minute, I chuckled, and then I brought Stan closer to my chest and turned to hide what I was doing from view. I sent a small burst of magic into the metal I held, and it instantly melted in my palm. Stan looked on from my other hand, and even without facial expressions, I could somehow, perhaps through our magical connection, tell he was curious, like he knew what I was planning. I glanced over the little stick man as I eyeballed the measurements, and then I closed my eyes and let out a bit more of my power and intention. When I opened my eyes again, 4 round, button-sized hinges, similar in design to what I had put on my revolver, sat in my palm. I looked back to Stan and gave him an encouraging smile. This might feel weird, I cautioned my little creation, but he simply toddled forward bravely into my other hand. Excitement burned through my veins as I gently reached out and plucked one of the hinges out of my palm. Then I nudged Stan's left arm, and when he held it up, I set the hinge halfway down the appendage and used a little magic to push it forward. As I watched, Stan's arm softened around the hinge and then wrapped around it like silver liquid. The fluid metal sucked the hinge out of my grasp, and a moment later the job was finished. Stan looked up at me and then back at his arm, and then he bent his newly acquired elbow joint back and forth. It glided perfectly. I wanted to fist pump in victory, but I remembered I had 3 more joints to go, so I set to work. As I sent each burst of magic into the stickman, I did my best to focus my will and intention into my creation, just as Nemrys had told me. I didn't know how specific my power was, or really what all it could do yet, but it wouldn't hurt to try. So as I upgraded Stan, I willed him to be a good little sidekick, and I instructed him to listen to any and all commands Aurora, Kayla, or I gave him. Several minutes later, I turned back to the 2 women with my hands cupped closed before me and a wide grin stretched across my face. I now present the new and improved Stan, I declared dramatically, and then I opened my palms to reveal the waving stick man.
Oh, how adorable!
Kayla cooed as she crooked her finger to wave back at Stan.
You've made him joints!
Modeled it after the one I used in the top break, I said proudly as I nodded at the new revolver on the table.
I think it is a vast improvement,
Aurora remarked as she bent down over my shoulder and smiled down at the stickman.
He can move so much easier now.
Precisely, I replied with a grin, which means I've already learned my first lesson in making animatrons.
Animatrons?
The half-elf echoed with a puzzled look. I waved my hand dismissively. Another word from my world. It means animated machines. I could also say robots, but that doesn't feel right since my creations are powered by magic and not some mundane power.
I see,
Aurora muttered, but I could tell by her pursed lips that she was still a little confused. Kayla reached out and touched my elbow.
What is this lesson you learned, Mason? How will it help us?
Well, I said as I looked back at the princess, I've learned that even with my new powers, my magic has its limitations. Take Stan, for example. I could make him a body and give him life, but I still needed to make his joints separately so that he could walk properly. Just like with the guns and Bobby 2.0, I'll need to make my animatrons piecemeal, and then figure out a way to put them together depending on what I want or need them to do.
Elias will be jealous when we return to Alaria and he sees what you've made without him,
Aurora remarked with a sly smile. Honestly, it wouldn't hurt to have his expertise, I admitted, but then I shrugged. I'll get by, though. It might take me a few more trials and a handful of more errors, though.
I have faith in you, Mason,
Kayla said as she reached out and cupped my cheek. I turned my head and smacked a kiss against her palm. Thank you, dear. Although I haven't even mentioned my biggest obstacle yet.
Which is?
Aurora questioned. Size, I replied with a frown. Nemrys told me before that larger creations would take much more energy to create and bring to life. I don't exactly know how much, but when I made Stan, I could feel a big dip in my power reserves even though he's so small. I guess breathing life into inanimate objects comes at a steep price. Coupled with the fact that I also have to make each part for the animatrons myself before I even use my new ability, energy is my biggest concern. I'll probably only be able to make one machine to start with.
And what are these machines meant to accomplish?
Kayla asked with a tilt of her head. Well, even with just the guns and Bobby, I started, we have the superior weaponry. If we were face to face with Dredd, we could end him in a heartbeat. The problem is finding him. He's had weeks to entrench himself into Cetus, and as we saw, he's covered a good portion of it in booby traps. If we rode out to meet him, my concern is that with his intimate knowledge of the landscape, he'd be able to ambush us. Aurora and I might be powerful, but we're not invincible. A soldier made out of metal, on the other hand,
could attack without the fear of injury.
Aurora finished with a wide grin. Exactly, I replied as I tapped the side of my nose. But first, I have to figure out how to make, power, and control it.
So, child's play.
Kayla teased as she held out her hand toward me. I glanced down in time to watch Stan take a running leap from my palm to the princess's, and he landed with a flourish on his bent new knees. I imagined what he could do if he had been human-sized, and excitement began to spiral through my veins again. All right, I said as I slid to my feet and clapped my hands together. Tomorrow we start work on our new project, but I need some fuel and rest first, so I say we go track down some dinner. Who's with me? Aurora and Kayla raised their hands in unison, and then Stan waved his little matchstick of an arm back and forth. Excellent, I replied with a broad grin, and already my mind churned through a million designs and ideas and plans to take down all our enemies. Chapter 7. The next morning, I woke up before the sun rose and silently slipped out of bed so as not to wake up Aurora and Kayla. They were curled on the opposite edges of the mattress, and their faces looked so sweet that a part of me wanted to lie back down. But I forced myself to put on my clothes in the dark, plucked Stan from the bedside table, and headed off toward the workshop. The castle was hushed and quiet as I wound my way through its many halls. I could hear the echo of doors opening and closing in the distance as servants went about their morning chores, but I encountered no one during my journey. However, when I opened the door to the workshop, I was surprised to find Gawain, the royal blacksmith, already working the forges. He was an older man, probably in his early 60s, with light hazel eyes and thinning salt and pepper hair. He was thinner than most blacksmiths that I had met, but when we first met, something in his eyes had reminded me of the watchmaker back in Ilaria. We hadn't conversed much, but I took him for a knowledgeable and intelligent man. I cleared my throat as I gently shut the door behind me, and Gawain snapped his head up. "Mornin'," I said with a smile.
"Good morrow, Defender Flint,"
the blacksmith replied as he bowed his head.
"I apologize for the intrusion. I did not think you'd be up and about this early."
"You don't have to apologize for being in your own shop," I laughed as I walked further into the room. "And please call me Mason. I'm really not into this propriety and etiquette stuff unless it's absolutely necessary, and it's just us here." Gawain frowned and furrowed his scraggly eyebrows.
"If you insist, Mason, but for the duration of your stay, King David has decreed that this is your space. Your work is far more important than me mending my son's chainmail."
He turned and gestured to a shirt of metal that was draped over an anvil. "Your son is in the Royal Guard?" I asked as I reached out and ran my fingers over the metallic links.
"He is,"
Gawain said with a nod. I picked up the shirt, and even without my magic, I found the tear in the chainmail easily. It was a gash about 3 inches long, situated just along the rib cage, and I saw flecks of dried blood crusted around the jagged edges. "Is he all right?" I asked as I lifted my head. The blacksmith nodded again, but his lips pursed into a thin line.
"He is alive and resting in the infirmary for a few days."
"What happened?" I questioned, but before he answered, I already knew what he was going to say.
Bandits, he snarled. My boy was taking some supplies to a nearby town. I think he's sweet on a girl who lives there. Anyway, he and the other men in his company were ambushed on their return. I suffered no casualties, but my son wasn't the only one injured.
I looked back at the shirt of mail in my grasp, and anger bubbled in my veins. From the lowest peasant to the king's own guard, it seemed no one was safe from the likes of Camus Dread. The people of Cetus had truly suffered long and hard, but not for much longer. Well, I think your work is important too, Gwaine, I said as I looked back at him with a tight smile. So feel free to share the workshop with me if you need. But today, I think you should spend some time with your son. The blacksmith tilted his head at me in confusion, but before he could say a word, I summoned up a little magic and funneled it into the metal shirt in my hand. As Gwaine watched with wide eyes, the chainmail wove itself back together again until it looked as whole and new as the first day it was crafted. When I finally withdrew my power, the metallic links practically shined.
Ow!
Gwaine started, but then he stopped himself as his eyes scrutinized me from head to toe.
King DeVite said you were a mage and a master smith, but I had no idea.
He trailed off as he reached out and took the shirt of mail from me, and then he ran his fingers over the reformed links.
This is incredible work.
That's nothing, I said with a shrug. You haven't even seen my masterpieces.
Yes,
the blacksmith responded as he glanced at the workshop table on the other side of the room.
I have heard talk of your extraordinary weapons, though I must confess the pieces you left behind were quite peculiar.
Those were just the scraps. I chuckled as I reached down and patted the top-break revolver that now sat in the holster at my hip. This was the final product, but it's going to pale in comparison to my next project. Camus Dread and all his bandits are going to meet their reckoning very, very soon. Gwaine's eyes jumped from the gun back to my face.
Your next project? What could be more powerful than your magic and that thing on your hip?
This, I said proudly, and then I reached into my pocket and extracted Stan. The blacksmith's jaw fell to the floor as the stick man stretched in my palm and waved. He looked from Stan back to me and back to the stick figure again.
What in the name of all the gods is that?
Gwaine gasped as his eyes bulged. Gwaine, I would like you to meet my friend Stan, I replied with a grin. He's a little something I cooked up with my magic, but he's only a first attempt. I plan to make much larger models, something that can take on Camus Dread and all his cronies.
How do you plan on accomplishing such a feat?
The blacksmith stuttered. His eyes were glued on Stan, and the stick figure tilted his head curiously as if he was trying to figure Gwaine out, too. Well, I'm not entirely sure, I admitted as I rubbed at the back of my head. That's why I'm here so early. I wanted to get started straight away because it will probably take me a while to figure out the logistics. The blacksmith chewed on the chapped skin of his lower lip, and I watched as the gears turned behind his hazel eyes. I waited for him to respond, but then Stan tugged at my thumb, and I looked down to see the stickman pointing at Gwaine. What you want, buddy? I asked, but Stan just pulled more insistently at my thumb, so I extended my hand out toward the blacksmith. When my fingers were inches away from Gwaine's chest, Stan jumped up and down in my palm and held his arms up. The blacksmith looked up at me in befuddlement, but I simply shrugged and nodded down to the little stick man. Hesitantly, Gwaine held up his hand, palm flat, and then Stan bent his knees and jumped. He landed and tottered for a moment before he found his footing. Then he looked up at the blacksmith and waved. Gwaine chuckled in amazement and waved back.
This is remarkable, the blacksmith breathed. You have breathed such life into him.
Yeah, I chuckled. Still not sure how much. I'm not even really sure how he works, but he listens to most commands and sometimes has a mind of his own. He'll give you a high five, though. Well, I guess a high one, technically, since he doesn't have fingers. The blacksmith glanced at me in confusion, and I grinned. Just hold your fingertip up in front of him, I instructed. Gwaine looked back down to Stan and did as I said, and the stickman jumped to slap at the pad of the blacksmith's index finger. Gwaine laughed with delight, and his hazel eyes sparkled.
"What can I do to aid you, Mason?"
the blacksmith suddenly said as he lifted his head with a broad smile. I blinked. What? Gwaine nodded down to Stan, who was now walking the lines of his palm like a tightrope.
"This is a miracle. Never in my life could I have imagined that I would witness something like this. I had heard the claim that you declared you could save Cedars. I'll admit, I was skeptical at first, but seeing this, I believe you are telling the truth, and I want to do whatever I can to help you save my kingdom."
A broad grin spread across my face. Well, okay then. I'll accept whatever help I can get. The first thing I